My Star Empire. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 651 Rescue. Lower the spacecraft's altitude and scan the planet, paying special attention to the forests and underground areas. Mingze felt that something was wrong with the planet, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The Nautilus gradually lowered its orbital altitude, and the scanner on the bottom of the ship began to scan the planet below the spacecraft. Taking advantage of the gaps in the scanning, Mingze and others went to the equipment room to change their landing equipment. A large number of holes appeared 10 meters below the surface of this planet. Signs of life can be detected in the holes. It is initially suspected that this is the underground gathering place of the Zerg. The Zerg units on this planet should have moved underground to hide. I suspect that the distress signal may be a trap, Xiaoluoluo said in a deep voice. Are there any buildings where the distress signal was sent? Are there any signs of life outside the building? Mingze frowned slightly and leaned over to the holographic screen to observe carefully. The place where the distress signal was sent was a large building buried underground. There was a layer of armor outside the building that shielded biological information. We could not scan the internal structure of the building or whether there were any creatures inside. The radar operator shrugged helplessly. I'll go down by myself. You guys are responsible for covering me. Mingze waved his hand and ordered everyone. Captain, you can't. Everyone stopped him in unison. This is an order. It must be executed, Mingze shouted coldly, turned around and walked to the elevator of the spacecraft. Among the people, the chief and deputy gunners stayed in the bridge, and the others followed Mingze with guns. When the Nautilus was suspended at a low altitude of 50 meters above the ground, the elevator door at the bottom of the spacecraft suddenly opened, and Mingze and others aimed their rifles at the ground. Captain, that barn-style building is the entrance to the underground building. We will cover you from above. Be quick. If all the bugs on this planet are attracted here, it will be troublesome, Xiaoluoluo shouted in Mingze's ear. Understood. Mingze nodded and made an okay gesture, lowered his mask and jumped down from the elevator. When his body was about to land on the ground, the jet behind the power armor suddenly started, allowing Mingze to land steadily on the top floor of the barn. Due to the excellent stealth performance of the power armor, the bugs underground did not seem to notice Mingze jumping down. Mingze nimbly slipped into the barn through the airtight door on the barn. Inside the barn was a spiral staircase from the top, with a hollow space in the middle of the staircase. At the bottom of the barn building was a circular elevator, and the signal light of the elevator was still flashing green. I think its power supply is independent. It has been occupied for so long, but there is still a power supply here. Looking around, there was nothing else except this elevator. Mingze stood on the elevator and pressed the button. The elevator began to descend little by little. After not knowing how deep it descended, a heavy alloy door appeared in front of him. The camera next to the door moved slightly and aimed at the stunned Mingze. Who are you? A questioning voice came from the speakers on both sides of the door. I received a distress signal from here, and came here to see if there is anything I can help. Mingze put his rifle aside and waved his empty hands. How is the Federation now? Have you repelled those damn bugs? The man shouted excitedly. I'm sorry to disappoint you. The entire river system has been occupied by the Zerg. We are the only remaining resistance force, so can you open the door first and let me in? Mingze pointed to the alloy door in front of him. Yes, but you can't take weapons. The man hesitated and agreed. In less than a minute, the heavy alloy door opened outwards, and the ground began to vibrate slightly because of the movement of the alloy door. At this time, the bugs hiding underground outside suddenly moved their tentacles. They seemed to sense the breath of living things in the air. Following the direction of the smell, all the bugs turned up from the ground and quickly moved towards the barn. Captain, you have to hurry. The bugs have discovered your existence. Nautilus, fire at full speed. Try to delay time for the captain. Xiaoluoluo looked at the black swarm of bugs on the horizon in the distance and yelled into the communicator. The top armor of the Nautilus suddenly unfolded, and a rapid-fire cannon stretched out from the spacecraft. A rapid-fire cannon also stretched out from both sides of the lower part of the spacecraft. In addition, some close-in defense weapons outside the spacecraft armor were all turned on, and the laser launchers were spinning around, waiting for the enemy to approach. Load antimatter shells, start ballistic calculations, and all weapons fire at full speed. With the Yanglin's roar, the 3 antimatter rapid-fire cannons on the spacecraft fired wildly at the surrounding insect swarms. One by one, the shells filled with antimatter whistled and shot around. After a while, a series of explosions began to sound around the spacecraft. The energy released by the annihilation of antimatter and matter on the ground directly lifted off all objects within a diameter of tens of meters. The front of the running insect swarm was directly blown to pieces by the series of attacks. However, due to the large number of insects, although the rapid-fire cannons on the spacecraft were firing shells non-stop, the number of insects did not decrease. And these insect swarms were slowly approaching the spacecraft. At this time, Mingze also saw an old man behind the door. The old man was wearing a white coat and holding a rifle in his hand. "I don't know who you are, but now we are surrounded by bugs. If you want to survive, follow me quickly," Mingze shouted at the old man. "Oh, wait. I still have research materials to take away. That is my life's work." The old man originally planned to follow the elevator, but suddenly thought of something and turned around and walked into the building. "Hurry up," Mingze shouted to the old man anxiously. At this time, above the underground fortress, the swarm of insects had approached to a distance of 2,000 meters from the barn. At this distance, the close defense weapons of the spacecraft can also attack, so the swarm's forward momentum was greatly reduced. However, this could not delay for long. These bugs were still advancing towards the barn at a speed of nearly 10 meters per second. More than a minute later, the old man ran out of the underground fortress, holding a metal box, and came to the elevator. At this time, the bugs were only more than 50 meters away from the barn, and Xiaoluoluo and others had already begun to attack with their weapons. Behind the Zerg swarm, countless Zerg scorpions began to crawl towards here, followed closely by tank beasts and 2 other Zerg units that had never been seen before. Chapter 652, Escape. "Captain, hurry up, we can't hold on any longer." Xiaoluoluo shot a Zerg mantis that climbed up the barn and shouted to Mingze. Mingze gritted his teeth, hugged the old man and activated the thrusters on his body. As the jet sprayed out flames, Mingze and the old man flew into the air and rushed to the top of the barn. "Cover your head." Mingze lowered his head and shouted at the old man. Although the old man didn't know why, he still obediently blocked his head with a briefcase. Mingze released one arm that was holding the old man and raised it to the ceiling of the barn. 3 missiles suddenly popped out from the launcher on his arm, ignited in the air, and circled and rushed to the ceiling of the barn. With a violent explosion, a hole with a diameter of 10 meters was blown open on the roof of the barn, and countless fragments fell on Mingze and the old man. However, most of the fragments had been blocked by Mingze's body, and the remaining ones that slipped through the net were also blocked by the old man's briefcase. The power armor slightly accelerated, and Mingze and the old man rushed out of the barn and into the air. Seeing this, Xiaoluoluo and others hurriedly made way for a passage, and Mingze and the old man rushed directly into the elevator of the Nautilus. "Go! Go! Go!" Mingze shouted into the communicator before he got up from the ground. The twin helmsmen who received the order hurriedly retracted the elevator and lifted the spacecraft up at the same time. At this time, the Zerg creatures that looked like octopuses on the horizon had fixed themselves on the ground with 5 giant claws, and then their heads suddenly opened, and a ball of blue liquid shot into the air. The Nautilus relied on its powerful maneuverability to dodge the flying plasma shells. "Full left rudder," Mingze, who returned to the bridge, shouted to the twins. The twins suddenly shuddered and turned the spacecraft to the left. In less than a second, a plasma ball passed from the right side of the spacecraft. If the spacecraft had not turned, it would have become a pool of molten iron. "I hope you are worth risking our lives." Mingze glanced at the old man coldly and said. "Of course, believe me, as the chief scientist of the Federation, you will definitely need the things I study." The old man nodded hurriedly, fearing that this guy who looked like the leader of this group would throw him back to the ground. As the spacecraft rose higher, although these plasma balls still passed by the sides of the spacecraft from time to time, their accuracy was much lower than when they were just at low altitude. Now the Nautilus only needed a little dodging to avoid these passing plasma shells. When the spacecraft rose into orbit, although it was still within the range of these plasma shells, their error was completely unable to hit the frigate-sized Nautilus. "Captain, look at the ground," Xiaoluoluo, who was observing the surface of the planet, suddenly shouted to Mingze. Mingze and the others turned their heads to look at the surface of the planet. They saw that the surface of the planet seemed to be boiling. The Earth was lifted up by the Zerg underground. The dark Zerg creatures lifted this oil and came to the surface. Then tens of thousands of small dots flashing blue light lit up on the ground. Immediately leave the current orbit and increase the altitude of the spacecraft. At the same time, evade without rules, Li Mingze almost cursed out loud. If nothing unexpected happened, these flashing blue lights should be the creatures that just fired plasma shells. The range of these plasma shells is extremely terrifying. After passing through the planetary atmosphere, they actually flew directly to the distant starry sky. Although their size is constantly shrinking, by the time they disappear, they should be able to reach the orbit of the next planet. As expected by Li Mingze, tens of thousands of blue plasma shells rushed towards the Nautilus densely. At this time, the Nautilus was turning around and rushing towards the distance. As the distance of flying away became farther and farther, the accuracy of these shells became lower and lower. By the time the Nautilus reached the orbit of the planet's satellite, the Moon, these shells had completely lost their accuracy. The closest shells to the Nautilus were hundreds of kilometers away. There are no high-value items on this planet, right? Li Mingze turned around and asked the old man. No, the most valuable things are in my suitcase. The old man patted his metal box proudly. Very good, Chu Lin, activate the planet destroyer missile. Li Mingze patted and shouted to the weapon operator. Yes, Chu Lin responded excitedly and began to operate on the console. A few seconds later, Li Mingze and Chu Lin put their hands on the spacecraft's console at the same time. Because this weapon is too dangerous and too cruel, it must be authorized by two pioneers at the same time to be activated. A piece of armor under the Nautilus suddenly moved away, and a missile was ejected from the spacecraft into space. Fire! As Li Mingze shouted, the thruster at the tail of the missile suddenly ignited. The planet destroyer missile instantly turned into a flash of light and rushed towards the planet that Li Mingze and others had just left. At this time, the Zerg on the surface of the planet also noticed the incoming missile, and plasma shells began to charge. Unfortunately, the flight speed of this missile has reached 70% of the speed of light. When most of the Zerg plasma shells have not yet been fully charged, this missile has slowed down and passed through the atmosphere, falling towards the ground. The Zerg Mantis and other Zerg around the missile's impact point watched this missile full of death dive into the ground. More than 10 minutes later, the planet began to shake violently, and huge rifts appeared on the surface. The magma in the rifts kept rolling, and countless Zerg soldiers fell into the magma. But this was not the end. After dozens of seconds, the entire planet suddenly expanded and was instantly blown into countless fragments. The Zerg on this planet were turned into mincemeat by the impact of the explosion before they had time to board the ship to escape. Three-pointer, Li Mingze waved his fist. Activate the cloaking device of the spacecraft, and we will go to the entrance of the wormhole, Li Mingze ordered the navigator. Received, the navigator set the destination of the spacecraft to the wormhole. The Nautilus disappeared into the universe in a flash of light, and the cloaking device completely concealed its figure. With the help of the gravity engine, the spacecraft just rode towards the entrance of the wormhole. At this time, Li Mingze also had time to have a good talk with the chief scientist who had taken such a great risk to rescue him. A few minutes later, in the torture room on the spacecraft, the old man and Li Mingze sat face to face. Chapter 653 Transmission Technology. Tell me, what valuable things do you have? It would be interesting if I knew in the end that you were just fooling us. Li Mingze held his chin with both hands, and a smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. No, believe me, the old man waved his hands quickly. These days of being trapped in the underground fortress by the Zerg and living in fear every day have made him a little sensitive. I believe you. Tell me what your so-called valuable technology is, and why you are hiding in that underground fortress. Li Mingze leaned back and leaned his body on the chair. My name is Hua Guangzhen, and I was the chief scientist in charge of space and physics at the Earth Federation Academy of Sciences. Before I was trapped, I had been engaged in the research of teleportation technology. Until 10 years ago, I received a communication from the front line that the federal troops had captured a Zerg biological building that constructed a teleportation device. After receiving the news, I immediately rushed to the front line, put the building into hibernation, and transported it to the planet just now for research. The Zerg's unique biological teleportation technology has provided me with new ideas, and my research has progressed very quickly. Unexpectedly, When my research was about to be completed, the Zerg's teleportation building was suddenly activated and rushed out of the research base into orbit. Countless Zerg fleets began to appear behind the federal front line. Only then did we realize that we had been fooled. Without help, I fled to the underground fortress near the research base under the escort of the soldiers, and all the soldiers went to the battlefield after sending me in. I have been hiding for 10 years. During these 10 years, I have never dared to open the gate of the base. I can only hide in the base and conduct research silently, hoping that one day the Federation fleet can retake this place and rescue me, and then my research will help the Federation regain control of the war situation. However, I never expected that the Federation would be completely defeated in the end. The old man sighed and lowered his head. A trace of sadness floated in his heart. Don't worry, there are still many people in the Federation who built spaceships and escaped. Our fleet is on the way to search and rescue them. Mingze patted the old man's hand, but he was referring to the Empire's bait fleet. Oh? Someone else escaped. I hope you can save the survivors of our Federation. I am willing to give you all the technology I have. The old man held Mingze's hand and choked up. Well, I promise you, but let's talk about the transmission technology you mentioned first. Mingze patted the old man's hand to indicate that he should rest assured. The old man withdrew his hand and sat back in his seat. His expression became serious. The principle of the transmission technology I originally studied is very simple, that is, to scan all the information on your body in this section, convert a target into data, and use the timeliness of hyperspace communication to transmit it to the other end of the transmitter. At the other end of the transmission device, this data will be transformed back into a human, a brand new body will be created, and the target's memory will also be stuffed into this body, but this involves an unavoidable problem, that is he still him after the transmission? The original target should have been killed, and the body recreated with the information containing all his data inherited everything about him, but it is no longer the original him. He has become a brand new individual, and everything about him is artificially created. Then, in this case, who is willing to erase the original self and replace his existence with a brand new person? This technology will become impossible to promote, but after studying the Zerg's transmission biological organs, everything has changed. The Zerg, as a race that once dominated most of the universe, although they eventually split into several branches and were defeated by various civilizations, but the path they once walked is still engraved in their genes. They can use this biological memory to send their spaceships into another space network for superluminal transmission. Although this transmission does not arrive in time, its speed is much faster and more convenient than the several known superluminal methods such as wormholes, hyperspace, and warp speed, and it does not require huge amounts of energy, which makes single-person transmission possible. After 10 years of research, I finally succeeded in invading the Zerg's space-time network. We can use the high-speed network built by the Zerg for ourselves to transmit our own soldiers, and the other party will not be aware of it. The probability of the two sides meeting in the space-time network is only 1 in 10 trillion. Once I can create equipment that can be put into use, the way of war will change greatly. Warships can replenish supplies and replace members at any time, and members can evacuate in time before the warship is damaged. Ground troops no longer need transport ships. We only need a transmission station to allow troops to appear continuously. Movement within the country no longer needs to rely on inefficient spacecraft. The movement of population on each planet only needs to be done through transmission devices. All colonies will become a whole in the true sense. The production efficiency of civilization will be doubled. Not only that, the application of tactics will be more diverse, and it will be possible for a warship to ambush a fleet. Hua Guangzhen, who was too excited and dry-mouthed, drank the tea handed to him by Mingze in one gulp. Although I haven't built a usable device yet, it's because the conditions in the underground fortress are too simple. It's really not easy for me to research. There is no top manufacturing capability at all. If you are willing to give me a lot of resources, I can build a usable epoch-making transmission device in less than 2 years. Hua Guangzhen patted his chest and promised. Good. Very good. Mingze clapped his hands excitedly. If what this person said is true, then the efficiency of the Imperial Society will be greatly improved, and the combat efficiency will be the same. It will become possible to fight guerrilla warfare with the Zerg. But why don't the Zerg use this transmission on a large scale? Instead, they rely on flying in a conventional way, Mingze asked puzzled. According to my research, in order to achieve this kind of transmission, ordinary energy is no longer up to standard, and we need higher level energy forms. And the Zerg today are no longer the Zerg that roamed the starry sky. Most of their technology has disappeared in constant replacement and escape. And the technology that can efficiently extract higher-level energy forms has been lost. Now they can only accumulate this kind of advanced energy crystals over time. They regard this kind of crystal as a strategic resource, and they will not use it unless it is absolutely needed, Hua Guangzhen explained. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 654 Captured. Energy Crystals. Hearing this word, Li Mingze couldn't help but think of the shell composed of pure energy crystals that he had manifested for Shenzhou before his rebirth. If this thing is really this, then the Empire has made a fortune. It is a shell that covers a small star system or a star cluster. If it is spread out, it definitely exceeds the cross-sectional area of a star system. Such a large number of energy crystals is enough for the Empire to develop to the point where it can condense this level of energy on its own. This matter is too serious. I must report this matter to the Empire Command Center. Li Mingze stood up and left the interrogation room. Captain, how is it? Xiaolualo and others asked expectantly at the door of the interrogation room. We must take him back to the Empire. The technology he has mastered is very important. Li Mingze walked through the crowd with a serious expression and walked towards the communication room. Because of the need to prevent the coordinates from being exposed, the Pioneer spacecraft cannot communicate with the Empire at any time. Only in very important cases can the encrypted information station be used for communication. Captain, wait, Chulin suddenly stretched out his hand to stop Li Mingze. What's wrong? Li Mingze stopped and looked at Chulin in confusion. Captain, we can't report his existence to the Empire through the communicator. We should send him back quietly, otherwise if the Zerg can intercept our communication, his existence will be exposed to the Zerg. The Zerg will definitely do their best to erase him from this universe, Chulin persuaded Li Mingze. That makes sense. Set a return route for the spacecraft. Let's go back to Shenzhou. Li Mingze nodded. The Nautilus, which was originally flying towards the wormhole, suddenly turned its bow and began to fly out of the star system. At the same time, the hyperspace engine also began to accumulate energy. At this time, thousands of Zerg warships of various sizes on several surrounding planets took off from the ground and flew towards the Nautilus. These Zerg had already locked onto the Nautilus with biological trackers when they were on the ground. A black meatball was caught in the gap of the Nautilus spacecraft elevator and brought into space. And the Zerg has been locking onto the invisible Nautilus based on the signal fed back by this biological tracker. Originally, they wanted to lead the Nautilus into the wormhole, but they never expected it to turn around. Therefore, these Zerg ships could only expose themselves helplessly, hoping to force the Nautilus back into the wormhole again. What do these Zerg ships want to do? Are they trying to force us into the wormhole? What is on the other side of the wormhole? Li Mingze looked at the Zerg warships that were gradually surrounding their ship in confusion. There was only one opening in the entire encirclement, which was the direction leading to the wormhole. Captain, we can only rush in. The scientist is still on our ship. We can't risk his life, Xiaolualo urged Li Mingze nervously. I know. How long will it take to charge the hyperspace engine? How long will it take for the opponent's ship to enter the safe range? If we engage in a battle with the opponent, what is the probability of surviving to start the hyperspace engine? Li Mingze asked everyone a series of questions. Report to the captain. It will take a full 40 minutes to charge our hyperspace engine, and the enemy's warships will enter our safe range in 10 minutes. If we engage in a battle with the enemy, although the Nautilus is much more flexible than the enemy's warships, our chance of surviving to activate the hyperspace device is only 17%, everyone sighed. Then rush into the wormhole. Li Mingze made a decisive decision. Understood. The twins who received the order directly adjusted the speed of the spacecraft to the highest. The thrusters behind the Nautilus were turned on again, and the stealth devices of the spacecraft were also turned off one after another. In a fierce jet of the jet, the Nautilus rushed into the wormhole not far away like a sharp sword. After entering the wormhole, Li Mingze found that the Zerg warships did not follow. There must be some conspiracy waiting for us at the other end of the wormhole. Li Mingze frowned and said anxiously. But now no matter what you do, it will be useless. The spacecraft has entered the wormhole. It is impossible to leave this naturally formed wormhole. You can only fly to the exit of the wormhole obediently. A few days later, a red light suddenly lit up outside the bridge of the spaceship, and this light made everyone unable to see. The spaceship has left the wormhole, but our detector has completely failed, Xiaoluoluo shouted to Li Mingze while looking at the holographic screen. Start the filter device of the spaceship window. This light is too dazzling, Li Mingze shouted to the team members. Sir, our filter device has been automatically activated, but it has no effect, Chulin replied loudly. For some reason, they felt tinnitus in their ears, and the tinnitus had seriously affected their hearing. Close the outer armor. Following Li Mingze's order, the alloy armor outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the spaceship bridge began to rise, but when they were halfway up, the light outside suddenly disappeared. Because the detector failed, the only way to see the situation outside was to rely on the window, so Li Mingze lowered the armor again. When all the armor fell under the floor, the scene outside the window made everyone gasp. Directly opposite the spaceship, there was a huge creature with a length of at least 1,000 kilometers floating in the universe. The creature's dozens of compound eyes and a huge eyeball surrounded by these dozens of compound eyes were staring at them, and these eyes were emitting red light. Obviously, the light that almost made everyone collapse just now came from the eyeball of this monster. At this moment, dozens of tentacles on the monster's face suddenly stretched out and wrapped the pioneer in the middle. Quick, quick, quick. Hide that scientist from me, Li Mingze thought of something and suddenly shouted to Xiaoluoluo. Xiaoluoluo was shocked and unbuckled his seatbelt directly and ran towards the rear cabin. After arriving at the room where the scientist lived, Xiaoluoluo handed him a set of heavy power armor. Put it on quickly. There's enough nutrient solution in the power armor for you to live for a month. Store your information in the power armor and follow me. Xiaoluoluo waited until the scientist put on the power armor and directly pulled him towards the hyperspace engine room of the spacecraft. When they arrived at the engine room, Xiaoluoluo directly opened a secret door, behind which was a person-high airtight door. Behind the airtight door is dark blue engine coolant. Hide inside, and don't come out until the nutrient solution is consumed. We can only help you so far. I hope we will all be fine. Xiaoluoluo pushed the scientist into the cooling pool, closed the airtight door, and then closed the hatch of the secret room. The next chapter is high energy. Those with weak hearts should avoid it. Ha. Chapter 655 Rebirth. Just when Charlotte closed the door of the secret room, there was a loud noise outside the Nautilus, and the hull of the Nautilus shook violently several times. Then, the outer hatch of the spacecraft was torn open, and a woman wrapped in a biological shell walked into the spacecraft. When Charlotte ran out of the engine room, she ran into this woman by chance. This woman directly trapped Charlotte with her tentacles and hung her in the air. No matter how Charlotte struggled, she could not break free of these tentacles. Li Mingze and others who noticed something was wrong also came to the Zerg woman from the bridge. Oh? Are all the people on the spacecraft here? The woman said in surprise after closing her eyes and carefully feeling the breath of life on the spacecraft. Very good, this saves me from pulling you out one by one. In fact, I brought you here today for only one thing, that is, to help me tell your civilization that it would be easier to die if you surrendered to our Zerg Empire earlier. If we wait until we fight on our own, I'm afraid your death will be a bit miserable. The Zerg woman laughed grimly twice, and used her tentacles to roll up Li Mingze, who is wearing a captain's uniform. I will accept your 2 officers, and the rest of you go back and convey my words for me. Remember, my name is Sevilla, the mother of the Zerg. After the Zerg queen said this, she turned around and prepared to leave. How could the remaining Nautilus team members just give up Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo and leave? They drew the beam energy swords from their waists and were about to go forward and fight the Zerg queen. Listen to my orders and return to the Empire immediately, Li Mingze suddenly shouted loudly to the group of team members, and at the same time he blinked his eyes with difficulty. After all, compared to the lives of him and Xiaoluoluo, the scientist on the spacecraft who could make the transmission device was more important. And even if this group of people fought desperately with the Zerg queen, they would just be sending themselves to death, as the two sides were not at the same combat power level. Captain, the crowd shouted unwillingly. This is an order. Take good care of our mother for me and Xiaoluoluo, Li Mingze shouted and disappeared outside the airlock of the spacecraft. As the tentacles attached to the outside of the spacecraft were retracted, the automatic damage repair device on the spacecraft was activated, and the large hole at the airlock of the spacecraft was immediately filled by the molecular robot. The Zerg Queen used her tentacles to roll Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo back to the Zerg spacecraft. The monster with huge compound eyes slowly turned its body and disappeared in front of the Nautilus. Looking at the spacecraft going away, the team members were extremely sad. They knew that Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo would definitely be in danger this time. The chance of escaping to heaven in the Zerg hinterland can be said to be almost zero. After rescuing the scientists, they controlled the Nautilus to cross the wormhole again and flew in the direction they came from. At this time, in the Zerg Queen's special spaceship, Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo were thrown into hall. Dozens of various insects in the hall kept roaring at them. Obviously, these insects were all senior officials in the Zerg. As the captain and the first mate on the spaceship, you two should know a lot of information about your civilization. If you tell the truth, I will consider letting you die more easily, otherwise I will torture you to death bit by bit. The Zerg Queen paced back and forth in front of the two, and her tentacles kept flying in the air. Bah! Use whatever tricks you have. I will never tell you the information of our empire. Xiaoluoluo's face was firm to Li Mingze's surprise. This made Li Mingze a little confused. Why Xiaoluoluo, who was probably from another universe, was so loyal to the empire? He didn't know that Xiaoluoluo had already looked down on death because she had died twice, not to mention that there were trillions of lives in the empire, and her mother, friends and besties in this life were still in the empire's Shenzhou. So she would never betray the empire just because of a little pain. Okay, you humans are so stubborn. They were also so stubborn when I captured the top leaders of the Earth Federation, but I already knew your answer. I was just teasing you just now. The Zerg Queen teased and clapped her hands twice. Two strange creatures with bloated bodies and faces covered with hair-like tentacles crawled in from outside the room. Brain-reading worms can read the information in your brain by devouring your brain, the Zerg Queen sneered triumphantly. She knew that these people would not confess. I'm really sorry, I won't give you a complete brain. Li Mingze snorted coldly and put his fists on both sides of his head. As he exerted force with both fists, red and white liquids spilled all over the hall. And Li Mingze's body slowly collapsed to the ground. Oh my god, so cruel. Xiaoluoluo looked at Li Mingze lying on the ground with surprise and said in disbelief. However, after seeing the two brain-eating worms speed up their crawling, Xiaoluoluo shuddered and imitated Li Mingze to smash her head. Like Li Mingze, the red and white liquid spilled all over the hall. Damn it, the Zerg Queen smashed the wall angrily. She thought she was safe after searching for the weapons, but she didn't expect that these two people could commit suicide in this way. 2 days later. On an ordinary habitable planet occupied by the Zerg, two lantern-like hatching sacks on a constantly squirming building suddenly broke open. Two mantis worms fell out of the two hatching sacks. It hurts, Li Mingze rubbed the carapace that had not yet fully developed and hardened with his claws. Oh my god, how did this girl become a worm? Li Mingze's familiar voice came from another worm next to him. The two worms, who were confused because of their sudden birth, looked at each other. Li Zhangyang, Xiaoluoluo, the two worms spoke at the same time. Shocked, Li Mingze patted Xiaoluoluo's shell and his own shell in disbelief. Although he knew that he would be reborn after his death, he never thought that he would be reborn in the bodies of these Zerg soldiers. He always thought that he would be reborn in an ordinary newborn in the Empire. Why are we reborn as insects? Xiaoluoluo patted his shell angrily. Maybe when we are reborn, we will choose the nearest one. After all, we have all been reborn once. This universe should not suck us into the black hole again, but directly send us to the nearest place. Li Mingze looked around helplessly and found that there were newly born Zerg mantises everywhere. Hey, you said, since we have been reborn as Zerg, do we have a chance to kill the Zerg Queen and seize her throne? Xiaoluoluo suddenly reminded. Chapter 656, Infiltrating the Enemy. It's a good idea, but we'd better make sure we can survive first, and the first step to survive is not to reveal that we have our own thoughts, because according to what we know, the self-awareness of all low-level Zergs is imprisoned, and they are just weapons that obey their superiors. Only when we become high-level Zergs can we show our wisdom, Li Mingze whispered to Xiaoluoluo. How can we become high-level Zergs? Isn't our level fixed? Xiaoluoluo stretched out his two claws in front of Li Mingze and shook them. No, every Zerg organism has a genetic code that can be used for evolution and upgrading, but the unlocking of this code seems to require a lot of energy, which means we need to eat through fighting, and in the non-combat state, all nutrients are supplied evenly. That is, there is only one way for us to become high-level Zerg, that is, To obtain enough energy for upgrading and evolution through war, Li Mingze's tone was a little heavy. He knew what this meant. It meant that their opponents had turned into soldiers of the Empire. Do we need to eat people? Xiaoluoluo had a look of rejection on his face. No need, we can devour the dead Zerg, Li Mingze sneered, and the pincers in his mouth kept mating. Interesting, do we count as infiltrating the enemy? Xiaoluoluo remembered the anti-Japanese war movies she had watched before, where spies inside the enemy were forced to kill their former comrades. It can be considered as, but you don't need to have too much psychological burden. Since arriving at the new galaxy, the Empire's land forces have been replaced by clone corps. The native soldiers of the Empire will only be responsible for the internal defense of Shenzhou, and all external tasks are completed by clones. These new clone soldiers have no independent thoughts of their own. They are completely war machines, so you don't need to feel pressure when you take action. Li Mingze thought of something and instructed Xiaoluoluo. You know, they can't die now. If they die again, they will definitely be resurrected nearby. If Xiaoluoluo is reborn into a male body at that time, it will be a bit embarrassing. Okay, Xiaoluoluo nodded heavily. Tens of minutes later, when the carapaces on Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo's bodies had completely hardened, they received a new order. A high-level Zerg came to lead them to the new station. After passing through the thousands of miles of tunnels dug underground by the Zerg, Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo appeared on a plane after traveling for an unknown number of days. On the plane, thousands of plasma worms that had attacked them with plasma bombs were pointing their guns at the sky. These plasma worms were very far apart, as if to prevent enemy bombing, and between these plasma worms were dense trenches, in which mantis worms curled up together to maintain a dormant state. My god, these worms can actually dig trenches. Xiaoluoluo looked at the scene in front of him in surprise and poked Li Mingze's stomach. Nonsense, they are also an interstellar civilization with a long history. How could they not know how to minimize damage? Li Mingze rolled his eyes in unison. Exclamation mark. At, the senior Zerg leading them pointed to an empty trench not far away and ordered something to Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo. After understanding what the senior Zerg meant, Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo hurriedly ran into the trench and hid. Captain, is a war going to break out? I see these bugs have entered a state of war preparation, Xiaoluoluo whispered in Li Mingze's ear. It should be. We should also go into hibernation first. If the Imperial Army arrives, these bugs will wake us up. Li Mingze patted the carapace on Xiaoluoluo's back and closed his eyes. In fact, what he was thinking was that if the Imperial fleet directly used destructive weapons to flatten the planet, they would be less afraid if they died in their sleep. Otherwise, if they died in such a devastating scene, Li Mingze was worried that Xiaoluoluo's spirit might not be able to bear it. I don't know how many days have passed. Suddenly, Xiaoluoluo and Li Mingze woke up suddenly. When they came back to their senses, the mantis insects around them also recovered from hibernation like them, and looked up at the sky in unison. With a loud bang, the sky was dyed red by red light like the sunset. One after another, the Zerg warships fell from the sky, burning. These biological warships thousands of kilometers long continued to disintegrate in the air, and the huge spacecraft fragments fell to the ground like hills. The plasma insects that had been prepared long ago seemed to have received some signal, and they aimed at the sky and sprayed plasma shells in unison. Tens of thousands of blue lights flashed from the ground and soared into the sky, and in the blink of an eye they rushed into the clouds. After a while, the blue shock wave generated by the plasma explosion in the sky turned bright blue. Then, several silver-painted Imperial Zeus-class warships flashed with lightning, fire and thick smoke, passed through the clouds and smashed towards the ground. The clouds in the sky were dispersed by these huge warships, and only the wreckage of the Zerg and Imperial warships that kept falling in the sky remained. The war has broken out, Li Mingze muttered to himself as he watched the fireballs falling from the sky like a torrential rain. Be careful to hide. Li Mingze pressed the stunned Xiaoluoluo back into the trench with one hand. At this time, a half-corroded Imperial Zeus-class warship slammed heavily on the ground not far from Li Mingze and his men. The shock wave generated by the heavy impact of the Imperial warship shot stones all around like cannonballs, and some insects that did not have time to hide in the trenches were instantly beaten into sieves by these overwhelming stones. Kill! In the dusty sky caused by the crash of the warship, the Imperial military song and roar suddenly sounded. A fully armed Imperial Marine rushed out of the dust with a rifle in hand. Charge! The senior Zerg in charge of this position directly sent orders to all Zerg soldiers through the mental network. All the mantises except Xiaoluoluo and Li Mingze rushed out from their respective trenches and attacked the Imperial soldiers rushing out from the Imperial battleship. Let's go too. Li Mingze patted Xiaoluoluo on the shoulder and rushed out with a large group. Xiaoluoluo was stunned for a moment before she understood what Li Mingze meant, and followed closely behind Li Mingze and rushed forward together. She knew that if the two of them did not attack, they would easily be noticed by this high-level Zerg, thus exposing their existence. Chapter 657 Promotion. The Imperial soldiers who rushed out of the spacecraft saw the swarm of insects surging in front of them, and hurriedly stopped their steps, firing and retreating to the back. At this time, Tang Shiz and Xiaoluoluo did not continue to chase like these weapons without intelligence, but began to devour the bodies of the killed Zerg on the ground. Because the orders of other Zergs took priority, few Zergs stopped to devour the bodies, and only some injured Zergs who needed nutrition to restore their body tissues stayed. Xiaoluoluo and Li Mingze limped and disguised themselves as these injured Zerg soldiers. Although the mantis corpses with green blood on the ground looked very disgusting, in order to evolve earlier, Li Mingze frowned and buried his head. While eating, he brainwashed himself. This is a roasted grasshopper, this is a roasted cicada, both are high in protein. There is nothing that cannot be eaten. But when he took the first bite, he found that the meat of these insects was slightly salty and spicy in the fragrance, and the taste was far beyond his imagination. Oh my god, it's surprisingly delicious. Xiaoluoluo, try it. Li Mingze broke off the thick thigh of the mantis worm that had its head blown off and handed it to Xiaoluoluo. The snow-white muscles were exposed in the broken leg armor. Xiaoluoluo frowned and took a bite to try the taste out of trust in Li Mingze. Oh my god, it's delicious. Xiaoluoluo started to devour the leg as if she had discovered a new world. I didn't expect this insect to look scary, but it tastes so good. It can be made into various delicacies. Li Mingze finished eating a mantis worm in a few minutes and pulled a second one from the side. Well, it tastes much better than nose beef and mutton, and it makes the body warm and full of strength. Xiaoluoluo pulled off 2 legs from the new mantis worm again and said in surprise. Okay, it seems that the edible value of the Zerg is very high. After defeating the Zerg, we can consider raising some as livestock. Li Mingze became more and more addicted to it, and stuffed the snow-white insect meat into his mouth frantically. When the gunfire in the distant spaceship gradually died down, the Zerg corpses were piled up on the ground around Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo. What they didn't realize was that their bodies were a full circle larger than their original size, and the armor on their bodies was also shiny. At this time, the battle in space seemed to have ended, and there were no more wreckage of warships falling to the ground in the sky. Not good. Hide in the wreckage of the warship. Li Mingze saw a black shadow flashing in the sky, and hurriedly pulled Xiaoluoluo to run to the wreckage of an Imperial warship that had just crashed in front of him. The black shadow in the sky showed its true face, and a series of fighter planes passed through the atmosphere and rushed to the ground. The machine guns in front of the fighter planes were aiming at the plasma worms on the ground and shooting frantically. One by one, the shells directly penetrated the fragile skin of the plasma worms and shot through them. Accompanied by bursts of screams, the plasma worms standing on the planes collapsed to the ground and twisted in pain, and soon they lost their lives. These fighter planes turned their guns to the mantis bugs running on the planes, and shells from the sky directly beat these poor little bugs into meat paste. Why didn't the Empire use weapons to bomb the surface first, but sent fighter planes to carry out a cleanup operation? Li Mingze thought in his heart in confusion. There is no need for the Empire to waste so much manpower and material resources to push the Zerg troops, unless the Empire intends to completely occupy this planet and develop this planet into a forward colony and forward base. Or there are some important resources on this planet that are extremely vulnerable to destruction. More than 10 minutes later, the fighter planes in the sky returned to the aircraft carrier outside the atmosphere. At this time, there were not many mantis bugs that could move on the ground. Just when Li Mingze thought that the Zerg was about to be defeated, thousands of holes suddenly opened up under the ground, and groups of new mantis bugs poured out of the holes, quickly filling the gaps on the planes. And there are a lot of poisonous scorpions mixed in these insects, which are obviously used for air defense. Let's go get some more dead bugs. Li Mingze pointed at the dead bugs on the ground outside and said to Xiaoluoluo. Just when the two had just left the interior of the spaceship, a team of 40 mantis bugs ran towards them. Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo were shocked. Have their identities been exposed? Was it too obvious just now? Just when the two were sweating profusely, The bugs suddenly stopped 5 meters away from them. A mental communication from the high-level Zerg came instantly, and Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo looked at each other. It turned out that because their bodies had been strengthened, they were promoted to the captains of 2 Zerg teams by the high-level Zerg. Their mission was also very simple, to hold back the Empire's troops on this plain that was already full of warship wreckage. I know what the Empire is going to do. Li Mingze was shocked, and he immediately understood his thoughts. The reason why the Empire has been slow to eliminate the Zerg on this planet is very simple, that is, they plan to surround a point and attack reinforcements, or make a feint to the east and attack in the west. After guessing that the Imperial fleet would not launch a devastating attack in a short time, Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo began to order these bugs to go out and collect the bug corpses outside for them. In this way, the two of them could avoid being directly exposed to the artillery fire of the Imperial fleet. After these men obeyed the order and dispersed, Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo entered the interior of the battleship. Because the battleship had been destroyed, the defense system inside the battleship was offline, and all the isolation doors only needed to enter the password to open. And it happened that Li Mingze, as the Emperor of the Empire, knew the universal password of the Imperial fleet. After entering a string of 120 different characters into the keyboard, all the isolation doors of the entire ship were automatically unlocked. Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo walked carefully in the battleship, always on guard against possible survivors. However, because these survivors came out to fight desperately with the Zerg after the spacecraft crashed, when the two walked to the core of the spacecraft, they did not meet a single living person. Zhang Yang, look at this room. Xiaoluoluo suddenly pushed Li Mingze's body and pointed to the room next to him. This is the encrypted communication room. Li Mingze was shocked. He didn't expect that this communication room was not destroyed by the explosion. This encrypted communication room is used by the Imperial warships to send information to the headquarters when they are trapped in the enemy's position. It will encrypt a message and split it into millions of copies and send them randomly, which increases the difficulty of deciphering the information countless times. Chapter 658, Taking Credit. Captain, can we get in touch with the Empire? Xiaoluoluo looked at Li Mingze with expectation. No, we must hide ourselves. If our communication is cracked by the Zerg, we will be in trouble. Li Mingze shook his head and reached out to close the door of the communication room. Okay, Xiaoluoluo looked back disappointedly and continued to move forward reluctantly. Just as the two were approaching the engine room, the hatch on one side suddenly opened, and an Imperial soldier rushed out with a beam energy blade. At the dangerous moment when the beam energy blade was about to hit Xiaoluoluo's head, Li Mingze kicked Xiaoluoluo away and pierced the heart of the Imperial soldier with his claws. The Imperial soldier spit out a few streams of blood and then his head tilted and he died. We killed an Imperial soldier. Xiaoluoluo looked at the soldier's body on the ground with some disbelief. She had forgotten that she was almost chopped to death just now. Don't worry, this is just a clone without emotions. Li Mingze turned over a barcode on the neck of the soldier's body on the ground to Xiaoluoluo. That's good. After hearing that the other party was just an emotionless clone, Xiaoluoluo's guilt instantly disappeared. There may be surviving crew members in the spaceship. We can't go on. It's too dangerous. Li Mingze stopped Xiaoluoluo who was about to go on and stopped him. After all, although the two of them have evolved a little, the difference between their individual combat power and that of the Imperial soldiers is not too big. If the Imperial soldiers have long-range weapons in certain spaces, the two of them may be shot into sieves. The advantage of the swarm has never been a single fight, but to crush the enemy with a sea of insects. Call back the mantises of our two teams to the spaceship and let them be responsible for cleaning the spaceship, Li Mingze said and began to communicate with the insects outside with his mind. After a while, the 40 mantis insects that ran back to the spaceship dragging 40 insect corpses. After handing over the task of cleaning the spaceship to these insects, Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo began to clean up the delicious food piled up on the ground like a small mountain. An hour later, all the insect corpses on the ground had been eaten by the two. Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo have evolved armor that is 3 or 4 times thicker than their original shells, and a spike has begun to emerge from their tails. According to our evolutionary method, we should now have both the close combat ability of a mantis and the long-range ability of a venomous scorpion. Li Mingze stretched his tail in front of him, and the bone spur with a cold glow inside suddenly shot out from his tail to the ceiling. The hard ceiling in the corridor of the spacecraft was directly penetrated by this bone spur, and Li Mingze could only see the flashing electric sparks inside through the hole made by the bone spur. Although the size of the bone spur is much smaller than that of a venomous scorpion, its power has not shrunk at all. We don't have to worry about the bone spur being too big and affecting our flexibility, Li Mingze sighed after watching another bone spur grow in his tail in less than a second. The sharpness and strength of our claws have also increased. Xiaoluoluo, who was standing next to him, gently scratched the wall with his claws, and a long scratch appeared on the wall. The metal plate on the surface of the wall had been completely cut open. At this time, the mantises that had completed the search mission inside the battleship also returned to Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo. Time is almost up, all the mantises should guard the gap in the spacecraft. Looking at the time on the screen beside him, Li Mingze hurriedly moved all the bugs to the only gap in the spacecraft. According to his understanding of the Empire, it was time for the Empire's landing troops to take the field. Sure enough, a few minutes later, bursts of shrill whistles came from the sky. Li Mingze turned on the monitor on the console beside him, and saw millions of fireballs in the sky falling madly towards the ground. When the red light on these fireballs went out, the shells made of black metal were exposed. These landing capsules that fell from the sky were the special landing capsules of the Empire's robot army. In the battle with the Zerg, it is best to use the robot army as the first wave of troops to attract firepower. When all the robots are eliminated, it is the clone army that is more cost-effective. After all, clones bred with nutrient solution save 2/3 of materials compared to robots made of solid metal. When these landing pods hit the ground, the armor around them suddenly popped open, and robots rolled out of the landing pods one by one, unfolding their bodies on the spot. The surrounding mantis bugs rushed up when the landing pods landed, and directly hit the muzzles. These robot troops did not use the small caliber rifles of the ordinary Marines. They were equipped with heavy rail machine guns. The shells fired by these machine guns could easily tear the bodies of the Zerg and penetrate them. After penetrating their bodies, they would continue to fly backwards until more than 10 mantises were penetrated before they consumed all their kinetic energy and fell to the ground. Seeing that their own troops were suppressed by the mechanical troops airborne by the Empire, hundreds of bulky tank bugs were sent to the battlefield. These tank bugs crawled out of the underground passage and rushed towards the robot army of the Empire. Because they needed to fix their bodies to reduce the recoil of their weapons, these robots were designed as heavy units. Their heavy bodies made it impossible for them to maneuver at high speed when they launched an attack. The rushing tank bugs directly used the thick armor on their heads to carry the constantly flying armor-piercing shells and sprinted forward. The huge shovels on their heads directly knocked the robots fixed on the ground away. The robots that were knocked away disintegrated into flying fragments in the air because they were subjected to too much force. The remaining robots quickly put away their machine guns and shrunk their bodies into an iron ball again. But this is exactly what the commander of the Zerg wanted to see. The robot without the machine gun is just an iron ball. The Zerg mantises that were originally suppressed began to rush forward and directly pushed these robots that were about to escape into the holes dug underground. These robots lost contact with the fleet in the sky as soon as they were pushed into the holes. Obviously, the Zerg units underground had dismembered these poor robots. Zhang Yang, what should we do? Should we go up? Xiaoluoluo asked as he saw that the battle outside was almost over. We must go up. The robot troops are no longer a threat now. It's best for us to grab the credit now. Li Mingze waved his claws. The 20 insects he led quickly rushed out of the spaceship and rushed towards the iron ball outside. Chapter 659 Tug of War. The main targets on the ground have been cleared. The next step should be a precise strike on the heavy targets of the Zerg, Li Mingze thought secretly as he looked at the sky outside the ship. In less than a minute, hundreds of beams of light fell from the sky and nailed the Zerg tanks to the ground. That's not right. In this situation, why doesn't the Empire use carpet bombing? Even if it is to surround a point and attack reinforcements, carpet bombing can be used from time to time to clear the bugs everywhere. Xiaoluoluo looked at the sporadic beams of light shot from the orbit outside and said puzzledly, "This planet must be hiding some secrets." Li Mingze hurriedly walked into the spaceship. "Wait for me." Xiaoluoluo glanced at the Zerg men fighting outside, turned around and followed Li Mingze into the spaceship. If they don't attack this planet, then the reason can definitely be found in the shipboard host. Although the shipboard host has been destroyed, the black box used to back up data is still there. Found it. Li Mingze came to a heavy sealed door and stood still. Is this where the black box is? Xiaoluoluo asked puzzledly. Yes, this is where all the information of the warships in the past 100 years is stored. Even the communication will be backed up here. Mingze nodded and began to slide on the password lock outside the room. In order to ensure reliability, the room where the black box is located uses a mechanical lock. There are various Chinese characters on a huge mechanical keyboard. After the password is entered, the sealed door of the room slowly opens to the outside, revealing a console inside. Come, let's see what is hidden on this planet. Mingze carefully tapped on the console with two claws. Got it, a holographic image was projected into the air. All warships, please pay attention. The order from the Imperial Command prohibits large-scale bombing of the surface of this planet. According to the remaining information of the Human Federation, there is a laboratory on this planet that studies the remains of the Zerg ancestors. The laboratory and the remains are located below the surface, and the specific location coordinates have been lost, so our first priority is to take this planet intact, no matter how much it costs. A middle-aged officer in the video ordered many warships seriously. The second mission is to find the missing officers of the Empire, Colonel Li Zhangyang and Lieutenant Colonel Xiao Luoluo. If the landing troops find any information about the two, report it immediately. They have made great contributions to our human race's final victory over the Zerg in the future. They are heroes who have won the Imperial Black Iron Medal. We must find them, the middle-aged officer said and hung up the communication. Mingze and Xiao Luoluo looked at each other excitedly. They had never thought that they would be promoted to the next level and win the Black Iron Medal, which symbolizes one of the highest honors in the Empire. Unfortunately, with their current bodies, they are destined to not be able to return to the Empire. However, the Imperial government will definitely hand over the medal to their mothers in the end, which makes them feel a little better. But thinking that they would never be able to return to the Empire with this ugly body, Xiao Luoluo began to become depressed. She curled up to one side and looked helplessly at the sickle-like claws on her hands. Hold on. Once we solve the threat of the Zerg from the inside, we can be reborn directly into human bodies. Mingze patted Xiao Luoluo on the shoulder, comforted her, and turned to walk out of the room. Xiao Luoluo's eyes lit up. Well, this is not impossible. Although it is difficult, there's hope. Xiao Luoluo quickly put his mood in order and followed Mingze out. The sealed door of the room where the black box was located was closed again. What should we do next? Xiao Luoluo asked cautiously. What should we do next? Of course, we should organize the landing of the Imperial troops and seize control of this planet at the same time, so that these bugs can find the remains of the Zerg ancestors for us. Mingze's eyes showed a cold light. If there is something he can use in the remains, it would be better. If not, he can make a deal with the Empire as a Zerg rebel. At this time, the Imperial fleet, which had cleared most of the threats on the ground, began to land directly. Transport ships came to the ground through the thin clouds. The heavy bottom armor of the transport ships resisted the sporadic bone spur shells fired from the ground. At the same time, the rapid-fire guns on the lower deck began to fire at the targets on the ground. Along with these transport ships were Imperial fighters, which kept weaving between them, using the cannons on their noses to shoot at the mantises on the ground. The holes on the ground suddenly trembled, and the Zerg hummingbird fighters rushed into the sky from under the surface. The targets of these fighters were obviously the Empire's aerospace fighters, and the two sides wrestled together after a while. From time to time in the sky, an Empire fighter would fall to the ground with black smoke, or a Zerg hummingbird fighter would be pierced by a shell and roll to the ground. The tail flames of the shells fired by the fighters, the rapid-fire cannons at the bottom of the warships, and the Zerg plasma shells intertwined and covered the entire sky. The originally dim sky was directly illuminated by the tail flames of these shells and the flashes produced by the explosion. You two have been promoted to captains, go to the battlefield immediately. Mingze and Xiao Luoluo suddenly received the promotion message of the commander on this battlefield. Because their bodies had been strengthened again, and the original captains had all died, they were directly promoted to new captains on the spot. Of course, this captain was just Mingze's understanding of the Zerg language, recorded in his genes translated into Chinese. This time, Mingze and Xiao Luoluo each had 100 mantises. Although he had more subordinates, Mingze was not happy at all. After all, they had received an order to go to the battlefield. This meant that the two of them could no longer hide in this safe spaceship wreckage. And what was the battlefield outside like? The battlefield outside was full of fighter plane fragments falling from the sky and machine gun shells that were fired from time to time. Even if he avoided these death gods that fell from the sky, once the Empire's landing ships landed, the Empire's ground-heavy units would appear immediately, and the 100 mantises under his command would not be enough to block the other side's gun holes. As an emperor who had always been in control of the dynamics of the Empire's army, he knew clearly what terrible things the Empire's heavy ground equipment was. In order to deal with the Zerg offensive of the Sea of Worms, the Empire had specially created many perverted weapons that were adapted to this kind of combat. After he went to the battlefield, he would probably be blown into pieces in less than 10 minutes. Zhang Yang, let's go. Xiaoluoluo knocked on Li Mingze's shell. If they didn't move, the Zerg leaders would definitely suspect them. Let's go. But not on that direction. Li Mingze's eyes turned cold again. He knew that he had to take the initiative to attack. Chapter 660 Imperial Troops Landing. The swarm led by Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo started digging tunnels directly on the ground as soon as they left the spaceship. Although mantises are not good at digging tunnels and holes, their numbers offset their shortcomings in digging efficiency. A total of 200 mantises dug the tunnel more than 10 meters underground in just a few minutes. Xiaoluoluo, order your swarm to collect the insect corpses for us on the battlefield. Li Mingze patted Xiaoluoluo on the shoulder and said. Then we won't resist the Imperial Army. Xiaoluoluo waved his claws in confusion. Believe me, if we fight hard, we can't beat the ground forces of the Empire. After all, the high-level Zerg on this battlefield have been accurately eliminated by the Empire. The remaining mantis insects are simply ants blocking elephants when facing the equipment that will appear in the Empire next. Li Mingze shook his head. When Xiaoluoluo sent his swarm to collect the insect corpses, Li Mingze sent 50 of his mantis insects to pretend to participate in the battle, while the other 50 began to continue digging underground tunnels. Zhang Yang, what are you doing? After issuing the order, Xiaoluoluo turned around and saw the bugs digging underground tunnels. If we want to survive in this meat grinder battlefield, we must get rid of the high-level Zerg who can command us, otherwise, they may continue to assign us tasks to die. Li Mingze bit his two pincers together fiercely. Just as the bugs were working hard to dig the tunnel, the first landing ship of the Empire finally landed on the ground. Although the mantis bugs on the ground surrounded the landing ship, their claws could not cause fatal damage to the landing ship with heavy armor in a short time. Beep, beep. After a burst of alarms, the bow shield of the landing ship was suddenly placed on the ground, crushing hundreds of unfortunate mantis bugs into meat paste. Then the alloy door behind the shield armor opened to both sides, and a heavy sound of footsteps came from the landing ship. As the lights in the landing ship suddenly turned on, Li Mingze, who stuck his head out, saw everything inside the transport ship. He knew that the ultimate ground weapon he personally participated in designing was about to appear. Accompanied by a series of drum-like cannon sounds, heavy mecha-tanks rushed out of the landing ship one after another. These mecha-tanks are supported by 8 alloy legs with a diameter of 3 meters, and the outer layer of the alloy legs has a layer of heavy armor 2 meters thick. There are 12 rapid-fire cannons outside the 8-leg armors, and on the main body of the tank, there are 4 turrets, 2 low and 2 high. The top of each turret is a double-barrel turret with a 5-meter-long barrel, and the surface of the turret is densely packed with heavy machine guns. The entire mecha-tank is 3 meters above the ground, and under its belly are more than 10 rapid-fire cannons of different calibers. And under and above the alloy shield in front of the mecha-tank, there are more than 10 flamethrowers facing different angles. As these mecha-tanks rushed out of the landing ship, the rapid-fire cannons and heavy machine guns on the vehicles began to fire wildly in all directions, and suddenly the entire tank seemed to have turned into an iron hedgehog, and nearly 100 bullet chains poured out from it. All the mantis insects that tried to approach it were shot into sieves at a distance of 100 meters. Occasionally, 1 or 2 mantis insects wanted to attack the mecha-tank from underground, but as soon as they emerged from the soil, they were beaten into meat paste by the machine gun under the tank. The Zerg scorpion hidden in the trench stretched its tail out of the trench, aimed at the mecha-tank and fired bone spur shells. Just when these dozens of bone spur shells were just fired, the radar on the armored vehicle locked the flight trajectory of these bone spur shells. The machine gun that was attacking the mantis suddenly turned its muzzle and shot the half-flying bone spur shells in the air. The Zerg mantises who seized some opportunities rushed towards the tank, but they ignored the 180-degree flamethrower system in front of the tank. When they just approached the tank 80 meters, these flamethrower systems were all activated, and the high-temperature flames of thousands of degrees instantly covered the 180-degree fan-shaped area in front of the tank. All the Zerg mantises that rushed over began to turn slightly red in the flames, and then they were burned to ashes. The Zerg commander, aware of the terrifying combat power of these mecha tanks, hurriedly dispatched all the tank bugs and plasma bugs hidden in the underground caves. As soon as the tank bug, which was in the front, left the cave, it saw the turret on the armored vehicle pointing its gun at it. With a sonic boom of 2 shells exceeding the speed of sound, the turret on the right front of the armored vehicle opened fire first, and the 2 barrels on the turret fired shells one after another. The first armor-piercing shell hit the tank bug's head armor but did not penetrate it, but got stuck on the tank beast's head armor. The second shell that followed it directly hit the tail of the previous shell, and the high temperature and high pressure generated instantly sent the first shell directly into the tank beast's head. With a loud bang, the back of the tank beast's head was like a smashed watermelon, and countless flesh and blood were splattered in the air. The heavy body of the tank beast twitched weakly for a few times before falling to the ground and raising a cloud of dust. At the same time, the other 3 heavy turrets on the mecha tank directly aimed at the other 3 tank beasts that had emerged. With 6 loud bangs, the 3 tank beasts that had just emerged were killed or seriously injured and collapsed on the ground. The ultimate war machine that costs as much as a frigate is different. Mingze looked at the mecha tanks that were pouring out of the landing ship one after another with blood boiling. Following these mecha tanks were Imperial clone soldiers wearing heavy power armor. The rifles in the hands of these clone soldiers were replaced with high-speed grenade launchers, which could fire deadly grenades at the Zerg at a rate of 120 rounds per minute. Go, go, go. Your Majesty, bless the Empire. With a shout from a soldier who looked like an officer, the soldiers of the Imperial Clone Corps roared and ran towards the area cleared by the mecha tanks. If the Zerg could dominate the starry sky with their proud sea of insects, they were like encountering their nemesis when facing the Imperial Clone Corps that had been fully refitted. Since clones are cheap to make, damaged weapons can be directly recycled, giving the Empire the same ability to produce soldiers. The Zerg can produce a sea of insects, while the Empire can produce a sea of people. The clone mothership suspended in the orbit of this planet is loaded with up to 10 million clone manufacturing pods. With the support of the new technology, it only takes 3 days to produce 10 million clone soldiers and put them on the battlefield. Although the lifespan of these clones has been reduced to 5 years. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 661 Rebellion. Such a rapid manufacturing speed determines that as long as the first batch of troops can take a safe landing area, as long as there is a clone mothership in orbit, the Empire can deploy troops to this planet at a rate of 10 million troops every 3 days. In other words, in order to seize control of this planet, Mingze must eliminate all the landing troops within 3 days, otherwise the next Imperial troops will continue to arrive. Now, after seeing that the battlefield commander had sent all the senior Zerg soldiers out of the tunnel, Mingze decisively ordered the 50 mantis insects digging the tunnel to speed up. The opportunity cannot be missed. He can take advantage of this time to eliminate the Zerg commander on the battlefield. In this way, Mingze and Xiaoluolu, who have just finished eating and evolved again, are very likely to become commanders on the battlefield. After all, those senior Zergs who rushed out should not last for a while and will be crushed into pieces by the Empire's mecha tanks and clones. More than 10 minutes later, the mantis insects under Mingze finally dug a passage leading to the commander's tunnel. Mingze immediately put down the food in his hand and pulled Xiaoluolu into the passage. Passing through the newly excavated tunnel, Mingze and Xiaoluolu came to a huge tunnel that was tens of meters wide. The soil around the tunnel had been specially reinforced and could withstand the shock caused by the impact and explosion on the ground. In this direction, Mingze closed his eyes and felt the mental fluctuations of the Zerg commander, and pulled Xiaoluolu decisively to run in one direction. A few minutes later, the two had to stop because the passage in front had been blocked by a giant worm with a diameter of tens of meters, similar to an earthworm. The several circles of sharp teeth on the worm's big mouth were still rotating. Mingze recognized at a glance that this was the channel worm used by the Zerg to dig underground passages. The channel worm can dig up the soil underground and then use its body to squeeze the excavated soil to the surrounding of the passage, and then rely on the colloid secreted by the body to reinforce the passage. This is the most important function of the channel worm. It is dormant, don't wake it up. Li Mingze knew that this Zerg unit, because it is the logistics unit of the Zerg, will not directly participate in the battle unless there is a special situation or the commander's order. When they have nothing to do, they will hibernate to save energy. Sometimes, they will be left around the base camp to serve as the last line of defense. Although they are thin-skinned and tender, their combat effectiveness is very low, but the channel worms are very sensitive to vibrations and the smell of aliens. It can play an excellent early warning role. How should we get through? Xiaoluoluo communicated with Li Mingze in her mind. She didn't dare to speak now. Since it has a mouth part, it must also have an excretion organ. We should be careful and should be able to pass through its body. Li Mingze thought of a way after thinking for a moment. Okay, Xiaoluoluo nodded with some disdain. Under the leadership of Li Mingze, the two carefully crawled into the mouth of the channel worm. Because both of them smelled of Zerg, and their body control ability had been enhanced after evolution, the two did not alarm the channel worm at all during the movement. Following the long channel in the channel worm, the two came to a place similar to a cabin, which was used by the channel worm to transport Zerg units. At the end of this hall, there was a petal-shaped entrance as expected. After the petal-shaped entrance was opened, there was a long passage behind, which was filled with white semi-solid paste. Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo had closed their olfactory organs to enter, but Li Mingze sniffed it secretly out of curiosity and was surprised to find that this white paste smelled surprisingly good. And it was refreshing. This made him think of ambergris on Earth, but ambergris needs to be purified by nature, while the excrement of this pipeworm is directly a pure fragrance. Interesting. Li Mingze smacked his lips and asked Xiaoluoluo to smell the paste on his claws. As expected, girls have no resistance to fragrant things. After smelling it, Xiaoluoluo reached out and dug a piece of paste and stuffed it under her shell. Biological perfume. Xiaoluoluo raised her head proudly and continued to walk forward. After a while, the two passed through the excretory organs of the pipeworm and returned to the tunnel. The front should be the base camp of the Zerg in this area. Li Mingze stretched out his claws and pointed to a fork in the road ahead. Sure enough, not long after passing the fork in the road, the two came to a huge cave. Thousands of mantis insects were scattered on the ground of the cave, which seemed to be the last barrier left by the commander for himself. Unfortunately, these mantis insects did not have hostility towards Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo, who were also Zerg. The two easily passed through the mantis insects all over the ground and came to the door of a huge building in the middle made of crimson flesh and blood. What are you two doing here when you are not on the battlefield? The commander of the Zerg waved his claws angrily after seeing Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo. Sir, we have important information to report to the Queen Mother. Li Mingze pretended to have a low IQ and said bluntly. All words are translated by Li Mingze's brain. It's impossible now. This unknown civilization that attacked us used a strong energy field to cut off our connection with the Queen Mother. We can no longer communicate with the Queen Mother mentally. The Zerg commander shook his head. Li Mingze pretended to walk around in disorder, came behind the commander, and suddenly shot the bone spur on his tail at the commander. Just what I want, Li Mingze snorted at the same time. But unexpectedly, because the Zerg commander's evolution level was several levels higher than Li Mingze and the others, the bone armor on its body easily blocked the bone spurs. Damn it, Li Mingze saw that the situation was not right, and rushed forward in a hurry, trying to use the claws on his hand to get rid of the Zerg commander. But it was obvious that the Zerg commander was much stronger than him, and he slapped Li Mingze to the wall with a slap. At this time, Xiaoluoluo took the opportunity to rush up and hug the Zerg commander tightly with his claws, trying to help Li Mingze get a chance to kill him. Li Mingze used his claws to kick the wall hard, and his whole body turned over and rushed towards the Zerg commander. The commander bit the pliers on his mouth slightly, and tried to tear Xiaoluoluo away from him. With a snap, Xiaoluoluo's two claws were easily broken by the Zerg commander and fell to the ground. Li Mingze was not distracted by this. For the Zerg, if they lost their arms and legs, as long as they didn't lose their heads, they would grow back in a few days. Li Mingze directly inserted a claw without a sharp blade into the commander's mouth. But the commander bit it lightly, and Li Mingze's claw was bitten off and swallowed. Haha, you two low-level bugs still want to challenge the authority of our high-level Zerg, the Zerg commander sneered proudly. Chapter 662 Getting in Touch? Really? But you have to understand one thing, that is, the wisdom of you Zergs will never be better than ours, Li Mingze sneered. Humans. You are actually humans. How did you sneak into our Zerg? But even so what? You are about to die here. I will keep your brains and carefully check what secrets you are hiding. The Zerg commander sneered and showed the 2 bone blades on his claws. You overlooked one thing. Why did I just say that the wisdom of you Zergs will never be better than that of humans? Li Mingze showed a sinister smile. Why? The Zerg commander was stunned for a moment and asked puzzled. Because of this, Li Mingze said as he took out a switch from under his shell and gently pressed the switch with his other claw. This is, before the Zerg commander could react, its body was blown apart, and its hard shell could not withstand the impact from its stomach, and blood and flesh splattered. And its head rolled in front of Li Mingze. Li Mingze stretched out his hand and grabbed the head of the Zerg commander in front of him, aiming his sharp claws at the ugly head of the Zerg commander. Although you have obtained the body of the Zerg, you will never be able to defeat us. As long as the Queen Mother gives an order, you can deprive all your rights. Before the Zerg commander finished speaking, Li Mingze used a bone blade to pierce his mouth and he lost his movement. At this time, on the external battlefield, advanced Zergs such as plasma worms and tank worms had been slaughtered by the Empire's mecha tanks. And Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo, as the most evolved Zerg on this battlefield, were directly promoted to the commander of the entire battlefield. However, this commander was also a name only. There were only 100,000 mantis worms, 50,000 poisonous scorpions and 10 channel worms left on the entire battlefield. Although the number is not small, if it is put on the battlefield, the Empire troops can slaughter them all in less than an hour. What should we do next? Xiaoluoluo stood beside Li Mingze, and small buds had begun to grow at the break of her 2 claws. What should we do? Let's deal with these Empire troops on the battlefield first. Li Mingze patted his head, which was a little headache. No, we might as well lead the troops to retreat underground and look for the remains of the Zerg ancestors, Xiaoluoluo suddenly said. But if we do this, once the Empire's troops capture this planet, we will be wiped out. Li Mingze frowned slightly. The situation in front of them was not good for them. We can get in touch with the Empire first. Anyway, our planet has been blocked by the Empire from contacting the Zerg Queen. Xiaoluoluo pointed to the direction where the battleship crashed. Okay, I'll get in touch with the Empire right away. Li Mingze nodded and walked out of the command center building. A few minutes later, the command center shrank into a ball of flesh, relying on thousands of tentacles under the ball to slowly walk on the ground and follow Li Mingze. All the Zerg mantises on the battlefield also received Li Mingze's order to retreat underground and barred all the entrances to the underground passages. The Zerg retreated. We defeated them. On the battlefield, the clone soldiers cheered with their rifles raised high, and the mantis swarm that was originally like a tide could no longer be seen. At their feet, countless bugs were gathering together and rushing towards Li Mingze. At the same time, Li Mingze also returned to the crashed spaceship through the passage. After re-entering the encrypted communication room, Li Mingze ordered all his subordinates to stay in the spaceship and not allow anyone to enter. When the door of the encrypted communication room was closed, Li Mingze stood in the center of the communication room and turned on all the switches. Start scanning biological characteristics and soul characteristics. Biological characteristics do not match. Access denied. The DNA difference is huge. The system has been locked. The soul characteristics of Colonel Li Zhangyang are detected, and the system is activated. After several red notifications flashed on the big screen, a green page suddenly appeared. There are several options on the page, namely contacting the fleet flagship, contacting other warships, and contacting the Imperial Command Center. Help me connect to the fleet flagship. Li Mingze tried hard to send Chinese with a generator. Please enter the authentication code. The system rejected the request and popped up a dialog box. 2,314,414. Li Mingze entered the verification code used by Li Zhangyang into the dialog box. The verification code has been passed. Welcome, Colonel Li Zhangyang. Please tell me what you need to convey. 10 minutes later, inside the Imperial flagship. Sir, we have received an encrypted communication from a crash battleship of the Empire. The communicator suddenly shouted to the commander. Put it in. The commander frowned. The encrypted communication video was decrypted and projected directly onto the main screen of the bridge. However, to everyone's surprise, the video was not of any surviving crew members, but 2 bugs. The 2 bugs in the video shocked everyone in the bridge. Could it be that these bugs have cracked the system of their spacecraft? At this time, the bugs in the video suddenly spoke. Imperial Colonel Li Zhangyang and Imperial Lieutenant Colonel Xiaoluoluo report to the headquarters. For some reason, the two of us entered the body of the Zerg after death and have now penetrated into the Zerg. Now we have controlled 150,000 Zerg units on a battlefield. I hope the headquarters can give us a chance to evacuate the battlefield where we are, so that we have the opportunity to unify the Zerg on the entire planet. The video ends here. Everyone in the bridge looked at each other, not knowing what to say. They never thought that the two heroes who had won the black iron medal that they had been looking for were right under their noses. And they turned into Zerg. Sir, what should we do? The officers looked up at the commander. Immediately send a spaceship to jump into hyperspace and contact the Imperial headquarters, and at the same time suspend the actions of all troops on the battlefield where Li Zhangyang and the other two are. Wait for the command of the command center, the commander ordered the officers around him. Yes, soon, a communication ship detached from the flagship and jumped into hyperspace. It is the safest to communicate through hyperspace, which can prevent being intercepted by the Zerg in the middle. Not long after, the Imperial Command Headquarters received news from the advance fleet. The entire command center was shocked when they received this news. No one thought that humans could actually turn into Zerg. This matter is of great importance. And the command center presented the intelligence to Tianyi. Chapter 663 Discovery of the Relics. You mean, the two Imperial officers we've been looking for have turned into Zerg and sent you encrypted messages? Tianyi touched her chin, thinking about the truth of this matter. Did these two people really turn into Zerg, or did the Zerg read their memories and try to trick the Empire into withdrawing its troops? Sister Tianyi, I don't think you need to worry. The encrypted communication system I designed needs to scan soul fluctuations. If there is an abnormality in the soul, it will not be activated. In other words, the bodies of these two Zergs are filled with the souls of Imperial officers. Eva came to Tianyi and whispered. But although this is true, we don't know whether the Zerg brain structure will have any effect on them. What if the two of them have actually defected to the Zerg? Tianyi still had some doubts. But if they really cooperate with us, even if they just use us to strengthen themselves, we can use them to weaken the Zerg, and these two people will definitely not be satisfied with being an ordinary commander. They must want to reach the position of the Queen Mother. At that time, we can cooperate with each other from inside and outside. If they want to regret in the end, the weakened Zerg will not be a problem. After saying this, Eva looked at Tianyi and waited for Tianyi's final decision. Tianyi lowered his head and pondered for a moment, and finally decided to agree with the suggestions of Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo. Soon, the command center received an order from the highest level of the Empire, requiring them to cooperate with Li Zhangyang and Xiaoluoluo's activities in the future and help the two to grow as much as possible. Any battle with the two should be avoided if possible, and if it cannot be avoided, cooperate with the two to act. After conveying the order back to the fleet immediately ordered all troops to evacuate. The Imperial troops who had just taken the position and were building fortifications suddenly received an evacuation message from their superiors. Puzzled, they moved the materials that had just been moved off the transport ship back to the battleship, and the temporary bases in various places were also removed. Transport ships and landing ships loaded with soldiers and recovered equipment took off and retreated towards the mothership. Without the pressure, Li Mingze breathed a sigh of relief. The Imperial army would definitely join other battlefields if they retreated here, which would cause the Zerg in other battlefields to be in trouble, as there would be many more enemies for no reason. But the misfortune of other Zergs had nothing to do with him. He just hoped that the Empire would not wipe them all out in the end. After solving this biggest problem, Li Mingze began to order all the channel worms and half of the mantis worms to dig underground to see if they could find the location of the laboratory and the ruins. The remaining half of the mantis worms were sent out by him to collect food for the two. With his subordinates, Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo no longer had to peel the shells, and could directly enjoy piles of insect meat. The insect meat was swallowed by Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo and turned into energy for the two to evolve. The carapaces on the two began to evolve towards black, and the originally brown carapaces gradually turned into dark black, and the muscles on their bodies began to bulge continuously. More than 10 hours later, two volcano-like organs grew out of the joints of their shoulders, and the top of the volcano was covered with petal-like tissue. When Li Mingze focused his attention on the two small volcano-like organs, the petal-like structures on the top of the two organs suddenly opened, and a group of blue electric light flashed continuously inside. This is a miniature plasma cannon. When two plasma balls shot out of Li Mingze's body, Li Mingze opened his mouth in surprise. This means that in fact, All Zerg genes are the same, but when they unlock a certain gene chain, they will grow in a set direction. The Zerg may not be a biological race born from nature. There must be an element of artificial intervention in this. Li Mingze touched his chin and talked to himself. What do you mean? Xiaolualuo, whose claws had grown back, came to Li Mingze's side. My sixth sense tells me that the remains of this Zerg ancestor may be related to the birth of the Zerg. Li Mingze hesitated for a while and still said his thoughts. Before Xiaolualuo finished speaking, Li Mingze's expression suddenly changed. Found it. Found the ruins. Li Mingze excitedly grabbed Xiaolualuo's claws and said excitedly. Found it so quickly. Xiaolualuo was a little unbelievable. How could this ruins be so close to where they were? She felt as if there was some force controlling all this. But how could this be possible? Xiaolualuo shook her head and suppressed her bizarre idea. Li Mingze took Xiaolualuo's hand and ran towards the underground passage dug by the channel worm. After running for more than 20 minutes, they arrived at the ruins reported by their Zerg. In front of the two, a thick alloy wall blocked the mantis worm's way forward. Judging from the newness of this alloy wall, it is undoubtedly a building of the Earth Federation. And the building buried deep underground has basically no other possibility except a laboratory used to study the ruins. Get out of the way. Li Mingze waved his hand to let the mantis worms dodge to the side, and aimed the two plasma cannons on his shoulders at the wall in front of him. After two balls of plasma were shot out, the wall suddenly exploded, revealing the messy laboratory behind the wall. Go in and explore the way. Don't touch anything. Li Mingze ordered the mantis insects around him, and then he flashed into the laboratory. The whole laboratory has become extremely messy. Various experimental equipment and personal belongings are scattered all over the floor, and there are a lot of blood on the floor. Obviously, something terrible happened here and the people here evacuated urgently. The power supply in the laboratory is still there. When Li Mingze turned on the light, the whole laboratory was illuminated. After seeing the red blood smeared everywhere on the wall, Li Mingze retracted his previous thoughts. The researchers in this laboratory should have met with an accident. Passing through this laboratory, Li Mingze followed the Chinese signs on the wall and walked towards the control room. If there was any accident here, the host in the control room would definitely have left images or records. Passing through several long corridors, Li Mingze stepped on the dried blood all over the ground and came to a damaged door. This alloy door was like being shot by a machine gun. The surface was covered with small round holes of the same size. Through the round holes, Li Mingze could even see the computer screen in the control room behind the door. Li Mingze kicked open the poor door that was already in danger and entered the control room. However, the control room was not covered with blood as he had imagined. Instead, the whole control room was very clean and tidy. In the corner of the control room, Li Mingze saw a chair and a power armor on the chair. Chapter 664, The Origin of the Zerg. There is a small hole as wide as a thumb on the helmet of this power armor, and there is a pistol in the hand of the power armor. What is this power armor? Li Mingze stepped forward and touched the power armor on the chair with his hand. As soon as his claws touched the armor, the power armor fell into a pile of parts. Where did the people inside go? Li Mingze picked up a few parts with his claws and thought puzzledly. From the sitting posture of this power armor, the gun in his hand and the hole on the forehead, it can be seen that the previous owner of this power armor should have shot himself, but there are no remains in this power armor. Zhang Yang, my subordinates have sent back the message. There is nothing found in this laboratory, except for an alloy door that is sealed at the bottom of the base. Xiaolualuo came to Li Mingze and whispered. It's good that there is nothing abnormal. Let's take a look at what happened in this base first, Li Mingze said and turned on the console directly. Maybe because the people in the base were in a hurry to leave, the main engine of the base was not locked and remained open. It seems that these people know that they are about to die, and they are not in the mood to care about the information saved in the host. When he turned on the host, there were several folders on the desktop. The research materials in them were undoubtedly the research on the Zerg ruins. 20 years ago, when a construction company was building an industrial park here, it accidentally excavated this Zerg ruins very deep underground. The Earth Federation authorities immediately blocked the entire area and set up a laboratory to study the ruins. It took them several years to break the door of the ruins. The Earth Federation authorities obtained a lot of valuable information from this ruins. The most important and unimaginable secret is the origin of the Zerg. Neither the researchers in the laboratory nor the soldiers fighting the Zerg on the front line of the Federation would have thought that the Zerg was actually a man-made race. 200 million years ago, There was a biotechnology company called Xinsheng and a civilization called Slop. This company focused on all aspects of people's daily diet and daily life, trying to use biotechnology to create products that monopolize the market. They succeeded. They first created a flesh worm that can produce delicious meat. Although this kind of flesh worm looks scary, the worm meat in its body is extremely delicious and nutritious. As soon as this kind of worm meat appeared, it swept the dining tables of the upper class of the entire Slop civilization. And the new technology that created this kind of flesh worm also took this opportunity to make a fortune. But gradually, they were no longer satisfied with just monopolizing the dining tables of high-end customers. They began to expand the scale of meatworm breeding frantically. Soon these meatworms appeared on the dining tables of most people in the entire universe. New technology has obtained wealth that it dared not to think of before, but driven by desire, in order to obtain more wealth, new technology began to create new species based on this kind of flesh worm. After decades of research, they created a whale worm that can devour soil and produce insect fragrance. After this whale worm devours the soil, it will produce a precious spice in its digestive organs. The fragrance produced by the spice makes it difficult for both men and women to resist. This spice was soon made into perfumes of various flavors and sold throughout the universe. Whether it was women who loved dressing up or men who were serious, they all generously donated money to take these expensive perfumes home. The perfume alone brought huge profits to new technology, which was no less than the profits made by the flesh worms. New technology, tempted by the huge profits, immediately started to study the next type. This time, they studied a special insect between biological weapons and pets. That is a kind of insect named tail thorn. This insect is not only as obedient as a puppy, but also has the IQ of an 8-year-old child. Not only that, the bone spurs on their tails have become a weapon for protecting homes. Many families who adopted tail thorns only need one tail thorn to protect their family's safety when they go out. Not only that, the flat back of the tail thorn can transport a lot of luggage. Even a portable mobile house can be carried by it. However, to the surprise of new technology, this new product did not arouse people's enthusiasm, and the number of tail thorns sold was very few. New technology, which lost a lot of research funds, gritted its teeth and continued its research. This time, they set their sights on energy that the entire universe cannot get rid of. A type of electric worm that can absorb free energy in the air and can convert it into energy by devouring food and finally gather into a plasma ball was created. These electric worms allow people to build power plants on planets without any resources. Not only that, this type of electric worm that only needs open space to be deployed will not affect the absorption of energy from the planet's core. In other words, many places that cannot create value can now be used to create energy. Overnight, a large number of energy companies in the universe wanted to buy this type of electric worm. However, how could the new technology that has developed into behemoth through meatworms and whale worms allow these people to make all the money? Not only did they sell this type of electric worm at a high price, but they also required that the profits generated by this type of electric worm in the future must be split in half with the new technology after deducting the cost. Although these energy companies are very dissatisfied with this overlord clause, there is currently only one company that owns this type of biotechnology. These energy companies can only suppress their dissatisfaction and invest large sums of money in the new technology to buy these electric worms that can generate energy for nothing. The birth of this type of electric worm made the new technology instantly become a supergroup, spanning countless star clusters in the universe. The structure of this company was so huge that the ruling class began to be unable to control it. However, in the face of huge interests, the company's shareholders and board members chose to continue to expand the scale of the company and research more diverse insects. Next, the spaceship Zerg used for manned aviation was researched. These extremely low-cost biological spaceships replaced the ordinary spaceships with longer construction periods and higher costs, and began to become popular in Slop. More types of Zerg were researched by Xinsheng technology, and people seemed to be inseparable from Zerg in their lives. However, prosperity will decline, and things will turn around. Because of the blind expansion of Xinsheng technology, the management's control over the grassroots employees has greatly decreased. Gradually, the entire company began to fall apart. A chief researcher of the company left Xinsheng company with a source of Zerg, a special cell organism called Star. What happened next was even more terrifying. As the first Zerg created and the mother of Zerg, The Zerg Queen escaped from the heavily guarded laboratory during the battle because of the company's internal struggle. Chapter 665, Pandora's Box released. The disaster was doomed to happen at this moment. The Zerg Queen, who found that she had the ability to control all Zergs, developed a mental network that could communicate with Zergs. The escaped queen began to gather her subordinates. Zerg ranches all over the universe provided the Zerg Queen with sufficient manpower. In just a few months, the entire universe began to be ravaged by the Zerg. The speed of the spread of news could not even keep up with the pace of the Zerg Queen's fleet. Many times, before the information reached this river system, the Zerg Queen's spaceship had already arrived in this river system. The worms in the river system were connected to the Zerg's internal mental network by the mental signal amplifier on the Zerg Queen's spaceship. Overnight, all the worms in the entire river system became killing machines. The meat worms that were originally used for food directly tore apart the breeders who raised them and escaped from the ranch. The whale worms used their talent for digging soil to lurk deep underground. The tail spines that were raised as pets shot through their former owners and swallowed them into their stomachs. The entire universe has become a purgatory-like existence because of this accident. The entire civilized society collapsed, and the scattered Zerg quickly spread to various cities. Some of the troops of various civilizations were swallowed up by the sea of Zergs, running out of the pasture before they even reacted. Even if a few troops reacted, they could not stop the Zerg army from advancing for the Zerg troops, whose arms were already perfect and already established. The entire starry sky has been ruled by Zerg spaceships, and all the warships of various civilizations, except those patrolling outside, have been crashed in the port. The army troops of various civilizations that could not be effectively deployed and mobilized in a unified manner were like a pile of loose sand and were easily defeated by the Zerg. In just 100 years, all civilizations in the entire universe became the food of the Zerg. The Zerg, which lost its enemies, was able to maintain a complete social group at first, but gradually split into several branches and started a civil war. Of course, these branches still evade the Zerg Queen. However, because there were no enemies and no threats, the Zerg Queen did not pay attention to the civil war among her subordinates, but fell into deep sleep. When she woke up, there was only one branch left of the Zerg, and the strength of this Zerg had been greatly damaged. However, since there were no living creatures in all the places that could be explored in the entire universe, the Zerg Queen was too lazy to restore the number of Zerg. She chose to sleep again. This relic was built by the chief scientist who escaped at the beginning. He used his knowledge to block the Zerg's exploration and hid with the original cells for thousands of years. In the end, he couldn't stand the loneliness and chose to commit suicide. After opening this relic, the Earth Federation not only got the origin of the Zerg, but also got the initial cells that created the Zerg. But a terrible thing happened. After opening the container containing the Zerg initial cells, the Zerg initial cells suddenly revived and entered a rampage state. The rampage initial cells seemed to begin to devour the surrounding flesh and blood, and all the researchers participating in the experiment were devoured by them. Scientists hurriedly closed the laboratory and cut off all channels connecting to the outside. But they didn't expect that the technology of their civilization was far weaker than that of the Slop civilization, which had entered the Fen universe era at that time. The technology they currently possessed could not contain this runaway initial cell. This initial cell easily broke through the laboratory's defense system and entered the research center. The experimental record ended here. Obviously, the person who wrote this record had encountered an accident. Mingze then opened another folder on the desktop. This folder contained the images recorded by cameras in various parts of the research center. Mingze casually clicked on the latest video and saw that the researchers in the video were running in a panic in the corridor. Behind them, black tentacles were twisting on the ground and chasing them. Those researchers who fell behind were wrapped around their thighs by the tentacles that caught up with them after running a few steps, and were pulled away and disappeared from the camera. After switching to another camera, this time the picture showed a research room used for translation work, which was the room where Mingze entered the research center. Several researchers in this room were holding chairs or knives and other things that could be used as weapons in the room, and they carefully guarded the door and waited for it. But obviously they underestimated the defense of this initial cell. The knives and chairs in their hands did not cause any damage to the initial cell that broke through the door. These tentacles easily pulled the researchers in the laboratory away, and then there was a one-sided massacre. The researchers in the laboratory had no power to resist the brutal initial cells and were pulled out of the door with screams. Li Mingze hurriedly switched the surveillance again, hoping to find the final destination of these people. Until the last camera screen appeared. This camera was fixed above the metal door of the ruins at the bottom of the research center. The metal door in the video has not closed, but has been open. Slender black tentacles stretched out from behind the door, and these black tentacles occasionally dragged back a struggling researcher from the outside. After the last researcher was dragged back to the ruins' metal door, the black tentacles closed the metal door heavily from the inside. The entire research center fell into dead silence, as if no one had ever appeared here. Only the scattered equipment and items could show what had happened here. Li Mingze took a deep breath and turned off all the videos. He now knew what happened in this base. Everyone in this base has been devoured by the initial cells of this Zerg, and this initial cell is now hiding behind the alloy door at the bottom of the research center. Immediately order the Zerg to surround the metal door underground, and kill anything that comes out of it on the spot, Li Mingze instructed Xiao Luoluo, who was standing aside, and at the same time ordered his Zerg to rush to the underground gate. However, at this moment, the metal door at the bottom of the research center suddenly opened, and dozens of black tentacles rushed out from behind the door and rushed towards the Zerg. The Zerg that had just arrived downstairs was pierced by these swarming black tentacles before they could react. The pierced insects suddenly shook violently, and their entire bodies quickly shrank down, like a deflated balloon. But this is not over yet, and then their bodies began to liquefy until they were completely sucked out, leaving only some outer hard shells that could not be liquefied. Damn it! Get out of here first, Li Mingze shouted and pulled Xiao Luoluo to run out. But these tentacles directly wrapped around Li Mingze and Xiao Luoluo's hind legs and pulled them towards the metal door underground. Chapter 666 Alien Gene. After Li Mingze and Xiao Luoluo jumped into the passage through the opening on the wall of the research center, the black tentacles following them suddenly stopped at the entrance. Several black eyeballs suddenly grew on the stopped black tentacles. After staring at Li Mingze for a moment, these black eyeballs began to shrink back. Finally, all the black tentacles retracted behind the metal door and closed the metal door tightly. Zhang Yang, how do we deal with this thing? Xiao Luoluo was frightened by the scene just now. She didn't want to be sucked dry. Although she was sure that she had a 90% chance of being reborn again, she didn't want to experience such a terrible way of dying anyway. There's a way. Li Mingze clapped his claws and immediately turned around and ran out. After a while, Li Mingze returned to the encrypted communication room on the spacecraft. He was still a little uneasy in his heart. After all, he was not sure whether he would succeed. However, when he entered the battleship system through his once highest authority account, he knew that he had succeeded. After some settings, a secret command that could bypass the surface system was sent to the fleet in space. After receiving this secret order, the fleet did not pop up a prompt, but continued to send this secret order to the Imperial Command. After receiving the order, the Imperial Command did not pop up a prompt to the staff, but continued to send the order to a special research department of the Empire. This research department is the research center responsible for the Imperial biological weapons, alien research. Muhammad saw this highest-level secret order in front of the computer, which he thought he would never see again. The secret order required him to immediately send a tube of red blood sample to the front line of the Empire. After receiving the order, Muhammad did not question the authenticity of the order. As a die-hard fan of Li Mingze's order is everything, even if His Majesty Li Mingze has passed away. At this time, Tianyi also retrieved a report from the system that a frigate took off from the Imperial Biological Laboratory and flew towards the Imperial front. She immediately became alert, because she had not received any relevant reports before. In other words, this might be someone's private action. She hurriedly scanned the entire communication system thoroughly. Finally, she found this highest secret order hidden in the deepest part. She immediately remembered that this secret order was set by Li Mingze himself, but Li Mingze had been dead for many years and it was impossible for anyone to know and use this secret order. Thinking of the two missing Imperial officers who inexplicably turned into Zerg, Tianyi excitedly thought that since these two officers could turn into Zerg, maybe Li Mingze was not dead. It is very likely that Li Mingze was also reborn as a Zerg. Otherwise, it cannot explain why a top-secret order that only Li Mingze knew was sent to the Zerg-occupied area. Tianyi was instantly excited. Li Mingze might still be alive. Although he might be reborn as a bug, this is not a problem for the Empire that has preserved Li Mingze's clone. However, Since Li Mingze only mobilized a spaceship through the top secret order instead of contacting her or mobilizing a fleet, it means that Li Mingze must have his own plan. He must not have the idea of returning to the Empire now. Otherwise he would have contacted her as soon as possible. Tianyi thought for a long time and decided to let Li Mingze decide whether to come back. At this time, the frigate carrying the red dot blood sample had entered a hyperspace and flew towards the planet where Li Mingze was. A few days later, the frigate passed through the wormhole and arrived in the orbit of the planet where Li Mingze was. The Empire's fleet was very surprised to see the arrival of this Imperial frigate. You should know that this type of frigate has basically been retired to various institutions as official ships. The Empire used Azus-class battleships and Titan-class battleships to support the war. Since this frigate came to the battlefield, it means that they have a mission. Frigate number 0031, please report your purpose immediately and stay outside the defense line. This is a combat-restricted area and non-military warships are prohibited from entering. The fleet in orbit quickly sent a warning to the frigate. This frigate is under the highest order to deliver special supplies to the battlefield. Here is her pass information. Report completed. The frigate also sent back a message soon. After reviewing the relevant information of the frigate, the Imperial fleet made way for a gap and allowed the frigate to enter the orbit of the planet. A few hours later, an airdrop capsule was thrown out from the warehouse of the frigate. After leaving the warehouse, the airdrop capsule ignited in the air and adjusted its posture, flying towards the coordinate point sent by Li Mingze. Li Mingze on the ground looked at the red bright spot in the air that was passing through the atmosphere and smiled with satisfaction. The next step was to test his luck, but he always believed that his luck was excellent. After the shell of the airdrop capsule cooled, the thrusters at the bottom started to start, and the airdrop capsule landed steadily on the open space in front of Li Mingze. As the shell of the airdrop capsule flew into the air, a safe extended from the inside of the airdrop capsule. Li Mingze walked to the safe and entered the preset password. The alloy door of the safe suddenly opened to both sides, and a bottle of green blood stored in layers of protective layers appeared in front of Li Mingze. This bottle of blood was the purest alien gene extracted from the red dot when it was captured. The reason why Li Mingze asked the biological laboratory to send this gene was to try his best to see if the Zerg gene in his body could withstand this highly devouring Zerg gene. After sending the swarm of insects he controlled to a distant place, Li Mingze asked Xiaoluoluo and the swarm of insects she controlled to surround him. Xiaoluoluo, my safety depends on you. Don't let any insects get close to me. Also, if I die, I will find you again, Li Mingze said and picked up the syringe. After filling the syringe with green blood, Li Mingze opened his mouth and inserted the syringe into his mouth. If it weren't for the fact that his shell was too hard and covered his entire body, he wouldn't have chosen such a dangerous method. After all, it was too close to the brain. When the green blood flowed into Li Mingze's body through the needle, the flesh where the blood was injected began to rot gradually. This was the result of the corrosiveness of the alien blood. Li Mingze could only hope that the powerful self-repair ability of the Zerg could repair him before he was completely corroded. However, as the green blood flowed into Li Mingze's body through his blood vessels, his body began to shake violently. Chapter 667 Devour. Li Mingze began to roll on the ground in pain, his claws frantically scratching grooves on the ground. At this time, his shell had begun to rot, and some places were even corroded. Xiaoluoluo, who was standing by, could only watch anxiously, but could not help much, and could only pray for Li Mingze in secret. After rolling for a while, Li Mingze finally stopped moving. He had survived the corrosiveness of the alien blood, and now the cells in his body were competing with the alien cells. Although the alien cells were extremely phagocytic, they had lost their main body after all, and their total number was limited. The Zerg cells in Li Mingze's body could be produced continuously. The two sides entangled together and devoured each other, and gradually the alien cells could not bear it and began to decrease little by little. The genes contained in the alien cells began to be devoured by the Zerg genes. Just when Li Mingze felt that the reaction in his body was getting smaller and smaller, and thought that the alien cells had been devoured, his body suddenly stiffened. Then several red tentacles stretched out from the broken hole in his body and wrapped him in a large cocoon. The entire large cocoon was still surging. Until a few hours later, a completely new insect with a completely different appearance from the original one fell out of the cocoon, and the giant cocoon turned back into tentacles and retracted from the back of Li Mingze's head. Li Mingze's body was completely renewed and full of streamlines. The black carapace was covered with purple patterns. Hundreds of very thin tentacles stretched out from the back of his head to form a helmet. His face had returned to Li Zhangyang's face, and he no longer had the original 4 pairs of claws and bone blades. His limbs were close to human limbs, the only difference was that there were several bone blades extending from his arms and legs. "You are so handsome," Xiaoluoluo stood in front of Li Mingze and said enviously. You know, she still looked like an ugly insect, while Li Mingze had roughly recovered his face and limbs to be human. "Here's another tube. Since I succeeded, you can do it too. But it was really painful just now. Are you willing to try?" Li Mingze said as he took out another tube of blood from the safe. "I am willing." Xiaoluoluo grabbed the syringe and refilled the alien blood into the syringe. Although Li Mingze looked very painful just now, no pain can compare to changing back to her original appearance. As a woman who loves beauty, she would rather die in pain than keep her ugly Zerg appearance now. "I'll help you watch. Let's start." Li Mingze felt it and found that her swarm was still under her control. She nodded with satisfaction and called all the swarms back. Xiaoluoluo looked at Li Mingze, gritted her teeth and inserted the syringe into her mouth. As the green blood began to be injected into her body little by little, Xiaoluoluo began to roll on the ground in pain. A few hours later, like Li Mingze, her body fell out of the giant cocoon, and the tentacles that made up the giant cocoon also retracted to the back of her head and turned into her full head of black hair. "I feel full of strength." Xiaoluoluo squeezed her fist hard, and a sound of muscles tightening was heard, and the stone in her fist suddenly shattered into a pile of debris. "Next, it's time to compete with the gene strength of the alien and the Zerg ancestor." A cold light flashed in Li Mingze's eyes. At the metal door of the underground research center, Li Mingze's figure appeared in front of the metal door. "Come out." Li Mingze grabbed the edge of the metal door with both hands and pulled it out. With a sharp metal friction sound, the metal door was torn open directly, revealing a brightly lit hall behind. A fist-sized black dot in the hall was wrapped and entangled by hundreds of thousands of meters long slender black tentacles. When Li Mingze pulled the door open, the black dot trembled violently, and thousands of eyeballs stretched out from its tentacles, all facing Li Mingze. "I didn't expect you to dare to come back." A big mouth suddenly grew on the black dot, and the Chinese language familiar to Li Mingze came out of the big mouth. "You actually have wisdom." Li Mingze was stunned. He originally thought that this initial cell only had the original instinct. But now this cell actually still has wisdom, which shows that the other party should have devoured enough human researchers and finally obtained their memories and knowledge. "That's really disappointing." Li Mingze rushed towards the black spot, and he flicked out the bone blade in his hand while running. Seeing the approaching Li Mingze, the black spot directly retracted the scattered tentacles into its body, and its body turned into a tall monster with more than 10 arms. The monster grabbed a device from the side and threw it at Li Mingze. Li Mingze easily dodged the device and rushed to the front of the monster. The bone blade in his hand directly cut one of the monster's arms. The arm was cut off in an instant and fell to the ground. Just when Li Mingze was surprised at the monster's fragile defense, the broken hand on the ground suddenly grew dozens of thin whiskers and connected to the original broken hand. In the blink of an eye, the broken hand and the monster grew together again. The monster roared angrily and rushed towards Li Mingze again. Its 13 arms instantly turned into sharp blades and chopped towards Li Mingze. Li Mingze instantly blocked the incoming blades with the sharp blades in his hands, but unexpectedly, these blades suddenly transformed into 13 hammers in the air. Li Mingze, who had no time to react, was directly hit on the ground by these hammers, and his hands were smashed into a pool of meat paste. But Li Mingze did not give up, and with a little force on his feet, he pushed himself towards the monster. The monster observed Li Mingze's movements and instantly pulled back one hand and turned it into a sharp blade, instantly piercing Li Mingze, who was delivered to the door. "You've been fooled." Li Mingze sneered slightly, and slowly moved the sharp blade that was clawing at the monster towards the monster with his hand. The monster looked at Li Mingze, who was getting closer and closer to him with a surprised face, not knowing what he was going to do. At this moment, the tentacles behind Li Mingze's head suddenly stretched out and instantly pierced into the monster's body. The monster's face froze slightly, but then began to sneer. This poor insect must not know his ability yet. The monster instantly began to activate its absorption ability, trying to swallow Li Mingze into its body in reverse. However, he didn't know that Li Mingze already had more than just Zerg genes in his body. The alien genes in Li Mingze's body constantly absorbed the genes in the monster's body, absorbing all the advantages of the monster's genes and adding them to his own gene chain. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 668 Split Body. At first, the initial cell had the upper hand, but as time went on, the initial cell began to feel that the power in its body was gradually draining away. On the other hand, Mingze, who was pierced, did not show the appearance of a serious injury. His eyes were piercing and his muscles were constantly rolling. The alien genes that absorbed the excellent genes of the initial cells began to transform Mingze's body into a more powerful body. The size of the initial cell began to shrink continuously, and slowly shrank to the size of a normal person amid a wailing sound. And countless black tentacles on Mingze's body stretched out from the joints and surrounded his body, waving in the air in disorder. The hole in his chest that was pierced had long been healed, and countless black tentacles in the wound directly pierced into the sharp blade transformed by the initial cell. No. No. You can't do this. If you don't kill me, I am willing to give you all the knowledge I have. The face of an old human suddenly appeared on the face of the initial cell, which was originally smooth like a mirror without facial features. Interesting, you are the scientist who left with the initial cell, right? In fact, you didn't commit suicide at all, but just combined yourself with the initial cell, intending to live forever. Mingze sneered and all the tentacles on his body penetrated into the body of the initial cell. As these tentacles continued to surge, the body of the initial cell began to shrink and was swallowed up in the blink of an eye. When the last cell was absorbed by the tentacles on Mingze's body were retracted. He also closed his eyes and began to check his body. Combining the genes of 3 powerful races, Mingze can now directly scan the changes in his cells. Not only that, he also found that he could fine-tune the cells in his body. What do you feel? Xiaolualuo, who had been waiting outside, walked in and asked Mingze with concern. I feel like I own the whole world. As soon as Mingze finished speaking, a tentacle began to extend outward from his hand, and the tip of the tentacle slowly condensed into a tumor. What is this? Xiaolualuo came to the tumor with curiosity and touched it. This is a brand new life. Mingze closed his eyes and began to mobilize the energy stored in his body to the tumor. After a while, the tumor began to expand wildly, and in tens of seconds it grew to the size of an adult. Under the gaze of Mingze and Xiaolualuo, a thin layer of flesh outside the tumor was torn from the inside, and a naked young man walked out. This man had the same bone armor and bone blades as Mingze and Xiaolualuo, and the tentacles behind his head kept flying in the air. Not only that, the man's face was exactly the same as Mingze's. This, Xiaolualuo covered her mouth in surprise. She didn't expect that another person who looked exactly like Li Zhengyang would appear in front of her. After this person completely left the tumor turned into a tentacle again and retracted into Mingze's body. This new individual has no self-awareness, but everything he sees and learns will be transmitted back to my original body. And this split body has the memories and abilities I want to give him. When I cut off control of him, he can rely on the independent personality generated by his memory to carry out activities, but once I reconnect him, his independent personality will be suspended. Not only that, he also has genes that are 99.999% similar to mine, and he obeys my orders unconditionally. Mingze closed his eyes and felt this new body and explained to Xiaolualuo. To put it simply, this person is my clone, and can operate independently without my control. Although he will not have love or other emotions, Mingze walked to the side of the split body and patted his body. You mean, you can control 2 bodies at the same time? Xiaolualuo was surprised. Yes, Mingze and the split body made a heart gesture at the same time. This is not all of him. I have fine-tuned the Zerg genes in my body. Now this split body can turn into a Zerg or a Zerg building at any time. Mingze clapped his hands, and the split person immediately stood in the center of the hall. Under the gaze of the two, the muscles of the split body suddenly disintegrated into tentacles that pierced the ground, and then the whole person began to turn into a huge meatball, which was still wriggling. After dozens of minutes, a conch-shaped building appeared in the center of the hall. The outer layer of this conch-shaped building was attached with translucent hatching capsules, which were exactly the same as the hatching capsules that gave birth to Mingze and Xiaolualuo. Fortunately, Mingze himself had swallowed countless insect corpses and accumulated a lot of energy. With the energy from the initial cell body he had just absorbed, he was able to split a split body that could hatch into a base. Incredible. This building can hatch Zerg. Xiaoluoluo obviously recognized the hatching capsule outside the building. Yes, and the Zerg units that are hatched are all enhanced versions with alien genes. They obey my orders unconditionally. Li Mingze waved his hand, and two of his Zerg subordinates walked to the side of the quank-like building. The bottom of the building suddenly cracked open, and dozens of thick tentacles rolled the two insects into the building. A few seconds later, the two hatching sacs on the building began to fill with milky white liquid, and two fist-sized black dots began to roll in the liquid. Li Mingze ordered all the Zergs to return to the battlefield immediately and bring all the bodies that could be collected back to the underground hall. These Zerg bodies still contain a lot of nutrition and energy. The two dead mantis bodies are enough for Li Mingze to create a new Zerg soldier. A few hours later, the hatching sacs above the entire building were filled with nutrient solution, and countless Zerg larvae were swimming in these hatching sacs. At this time, the first hatched unit had grown to a height of 1 person, and its claws began to slide continuously on the hatching sac. Sensing its desire to be born, the hatching sac hung from the top of the building to the ground. The bottom of the hatching sac suddenly opened an opening, and a Zerg mantis that was completely black and had no difference in appearance from the mantis fell from the hatching sac to the ground. Although the appearance of the two is not much different, the bones and muscle structure of the new mantis have been strengthened, and the blood has corrosive ability. They can be said to have been reborn. And the most important thing is that the connection between the newly hatched Zerg and the Zerg Queen has been completely severed, and it is now the Zerg army that belongs only to Li Mingze. Chapter 669, Sneak Attack on Friendly Forces. Following behind the mantis was the low-level ranged scorpion of the Zerg. Like the mantis, the scorpion had the same appearance as the original Zerg troop, but its range was increased by 10%. The bone spur shells also had corrosive properties after exploding. The larvae of the tankworm hatched behind the scorpion. Because of its huge size, the larvae would continue to devour food and grow. In addition to these classic troop types, Li Mingze also created some plasma worms and channel worms for experiments. Due to the limited number of hatching capsules in the hatchery, Li Mingze could only split out 9 more scorpions. These 9 scorpions would go to suitable places in various parts of the plains and be transformed into hatching centers. And they would be responsible for collecting nearby Zerg corpses and transforming them into new Zerg. In just 2 days, all the Zerg corpses on the battlefield had disappeared, replaced by 100,000 mantis worms and 100 channel worms. Some people may wonder why Li Mingze only created the lowest level soldiers and channel worms, and only built a few intermediate Zergs such as plasma worms for research and data collection. In fact, Li Mingze had other considerations. If the number of intermediate Zergs was too large, it would definitely cause tension among commanders on other battlefields. Moreover, the advanced units of the Zerg were aimed at other civilizations. If Li Mingze planned to start a civil war, the role that the intermediate and advanced Zerg units could play would be limited. A few hours later, Li Mingze and 100,000 Zergs stood in the center of the plain. Just now, he had obtained the distribution map of the Zergs on the surrounding battlefields through the Imperial fleet in orbit. Next, he planned to lead the Zergs to turn the surrounding Zergs into nutrients for creating new Zergs. Li Mingze's main body remained in the lobby base of the underground research center, and his split body went into battle. Li Mingze did not say anything to these Zerg soldiers, who did not have independent consciousness. He just had a thought, and the 100,000 Zergs poured into the bodies of 100 channel worms. After all the mantis bugs were loaded, 100 channel bugs drilled into the ground at the same time and rushed to the nearest battlefield. In a canyon more than 100 kilometers away from the plane where Li Mingze was, hundreds of fighter planes roared through the air, and the poisonous scorpions on the ground kept spraying bone spur shells at the aerospace fighters in the sky. However, these bone spur shells had little effect, and the sporadic shells were easily avoided by the fighters. The fleet immediately lowered its altitude after discovering that the Zerg's anti-aircraft firepower was already very weak, and began to use machine guns to clear the poisonous scorpions on the ground. But at this time, tens of thousands of poisonous scorpions drilled out from the ground and aimed the bone spur shells at the sky. The fighters in the sky were shocked. It didn't matter if they were attacked by bone spur shells. Their mobility could avoid these shells, but above their heads, the second batch of landing troops were airborne. The Zerg on the ground obviously also discovered the Imperial troops that were airborne, So they used all the resources to hatch long-range arms and prepare to intercept the Imperial troops in the air. Suddenly, the ground shook violently. 100 channel worms suddenly broke through the soil on the ground and rushed into the air, losing potential energy in mid-air and falling to the ground. Then 100,000 mantis worms rushed into the Zerg position from the mouths of these 100 channel worms. The Zerg commander on the battlefield was confused and had no idea of the current situation. Under the nervous gaze of the Zerg commander, these new Zergs just ran into the battlefield in a scattered manner and did not attack the Zerg passing by on the way. The Zerg commander shook his head. He was really overthinking. Even if he lost contact with the Queen Mother, it was impossible for a Zerg commander to want to rebel. Could it be that this group of Zerg troops that suddenly appeared came to reinforce them? However, before he could breathe a sigh of relief, he saw Mingze appear on the battlefield. The moment he saw Mingze's figure, the Zerg commander was suddenly shocked. Mingze's appearance was completely different from that of the Zerg commander. But even if he found out, it was too late. The new Zerg mantises scattered in the Zerg position had already scattered to the side of those poisonous scorpions and ordinary mantises. Before these scorpions and mantises could react, he used the bone blades in his hands to pierce through them. In an instant, the Zerg controlled by the Zerg commander was slaughtered by a huge number of 100,000. The number of Zerg on the battlefield was not large to begin with, and a large amount of resources were used to hatch the more expensive scorpions. After the Imperial fighter plane hovering in the air saw what was happening on the ground, the pilot smiled slightly and led the fleet back into the air. Their goal had been achieved, which was to attract the attention of the Zerg for Mingze so that he could directly enter the battlefield and pretend to come to support. The Imperial troops that were airborne were just filled with nutrient solution for Mingze's supplies, and there were no soldiers on board. At this time, the swarm of Zerg controlled by Mingze had already fought with the Zerg soldiers. Although the armor strength and bone blade strength of the new Zerg created by Mingze were not much stronger than ordinary Zerg, even if they were slightly stronger, they would play a huge role on the battlefield. Many times, the bone blade of an ordinary mantis would get stuck after being inserted into the bone armor of a new mantis, and then be killed by the new mantis. The bone blade of the new mantis is stronger than that of the ordinary mantis, so it will not get stuck after piercing the body of the ordinary mantis. Just like cutting tofu, it can easily cut through their shells. In just over 10 minutes, the low-level Zerg on the battlefield had been wiped out. The swarm of Zerg controlled by Mingze had gathered and surrounded the base camp of the Zerg commander on the battlefield. The dark swarm of Zerg blocked the underground passage tightly. On the opposite side of the swarm of Zerg were several rows of tank worms and plasma worms, flashing blue light behind them. Why did you betray the Queen Mother? You will never survive when the Queen Mother's fleet defeats the civilizations surrounding us outside. Don't be lucky. If you surrender now, I can promise not to report this to the Queen Mother. The Zerg commander stood on the head of a plasma worm and pointed his bone blade at Mingze and shouted. Humph! Mingze sneered and turned around. Countless mantis worms immediately rushed towards the Zerg commander like a tide. The surviving 80,000 new mantis worms instantly overwhelmed the few tank worms and plasma worms. Soon, the tank worms rushed out of the swarm, twisting wildly, trying to throw away the mantis worms crawling all over their bodies. Chapter 670, One Pot. But unfortunately, no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't get rid of the mantises on their bodies. Their sharp claws firmly penetrated into the tank worms' bodies through the gaps in the bone armor. Although they couldn't get rid of these annoying mantises on their bodies, these mantises couldn't cause much damage to them. The two sides were deadlocked. But soon the tank worm found a solution. It began to crash into the surrounding walls. With each collision, some of the mantises on its body were crushed into meat paste. Seeing this, other tank worms followed suit, and the mantis worms controlled by Mingze began to suffer heavy casualties. At this time, several blue light balls suddenly shot out from the back of the opponent's team from the encirclement of the mantis worm sea. Wherever this blue light ball passed, all the mantis worms turned into ashes. But Mingze didn't panic, but smiled faintly, as if he didn't care about the death and injury of these mantis worms. But a moment later, the ground suddenly shook, and the part of the ground where the tank worms and plasma worms were located suddenly sank down. These tank worms, plasma worms, and some of the mantis worms controlled by Mingze fell into the huge pit. If this pit was just a deep pit, it would be fine, but below this deep pit is a piece of molten magma that keeps rolling. These tank worms, plasma worms, and mantis worms fell into the magma with a terrified roar, and were swallowed by the magma in the blink of an eye. The commander of the Zerg lost all the intermediate Zergs, and Li Mingze also lost nearly 10,000 new mantises. However, Li Mingze's goal has been achieved. The Zerg corpses on the battlefield are enough for him to build another 60,000 to 70,000 Zerg swarms, so he didn't care about the loss of 100 channel worms and tens of thousands of mantis worms. 10 split bodies that rushed over from the base were transformed into 10 hatching centers on the spot. The Zerg corpses on the battlefield were thrown into the hatching center one after another. It didn't take long for new mantis worms to crawl out of the hatching capsules and stand around Li Mingze. In just 2 days, Li Mingze increased the number of Zerg swarms to 150,000. As before, he only created 80,000 mantis worms and 150 channel worms. These simple Zerg units were enough for him to deal with the next battle. With the support of the Imperial fleet in orbit, the number of Li Mingze's Zerg swarms grew larger and larger. In just 6 days, his Zerg swarm expanded to half of the planet. The remaining Zerg on the planet seemed to have sensed the danger and all hid deep underground and never showed up again. In a cave deep underground, the few dozen Zerg commanders left on the planet gathered together. Because the highest commander of this planet had been eliminated by the Imperial fleet in orbit, these commanders were only at the same level and no one had the ability to command others. So the originally efficient command system instantly became independent, and the combat efficiency of the entire Zerg swarm began to become low. We can't go on like this. We must elect a senior commander with supreme command to command us. Otherwise, if we continue to fight on our own, we will be defeated by the traitor and the human race, a Zerg commander suggested to the Zerg commanders sitting around. But this question seems to be a dead end. All Zerg commanders want to become senior commanders with supreme command and don't want to be cannon fodder controlled by others. But to become a higher level commander who commands other commanders, you need to evolve yourself to a higher level, and to evolve to a higher level of existence requires a lot of energy and nutrition. To obtain so much energy, you can only get it by devouring creatures, and now the only creatures that can be obtained quickly are the Zerg under their own command. As long as a commander devours all the Zerg soldiers under his command, he will definitely be promoted to higher level Zerg, there is no doubt about that. But the problem is, if everyone wants to become the supreme commander and devour the Zerg swarm they control, they will collapse without a fight. Without troops, what can we use to fight the rebels and the enemies in orbit? Hasn't the Queen Mother's fleet reached us yet? A Zerg commander waved his bone blade twice and asked in confusion. My territory has just recovered a communication ship sent by the Queen Mother. The situation outside is very bad for our Zerg. The fleet of this human civilization has raided more than 30 of our colonies. Not only are their warships powerful, but their ground forces also use human wave tactics like us. The number of their troops is no less than our Zerg swarm, and they also have the help of powerful war machines. Our Zerg front is retreating step by step. We have lost more than 50 colonies now, and our soldiers on these more than 50 colonies have been almost wiped out. The Queen Mother is mobilizing the fleet and troops in the rear, so that we can hold our positions and wait for reinforcements, a Zerg commander sighed and said in frustration. Unfortunately, the Queen Mother did not know that the highest commander of this planet and his subordinates had been wiped out in orbit. Now the Zerg on this planet are leaderless, and their mental communications have been blocked by the Empire. In that case, before we return to the Queen Mother's embrace, each commander will take turns to command. Each commander will command for 3 days, starting with a commander with the largest number of subordinates. A Zerg commander moved the pincers on his mouth and suggested to the other commanders. At this moment, the first democratic command system in the history of the Zerg was born. However, at this historic moment, thousands of channel worms suddenly drilled through the stone walls around the cave, and swallowed all the soil above the cave into their stomachs, turning the cave into a huge open air basin. Dozens of Zerg commanders looked at the channel worms that kept spinning around them in fear. In an instant, they had already sensed the arrival of extreme danger. In panic, they hurriedly called their men to come and guard, but the Zerg under their command did not respond. These Zerg commanders did not know that Li Mingze sacrificed tens of thousands of channel worms to dig all the underground spaces around the cave to the depth of magma. When these channel worms dug upwards to the bottom of the Zerg swarms hiding in dormant underground, these channel worms and the Zerg swarms fell into the magma underground. The nearest unit that the Zerg commanders could mobilize was now tens of kilometers away. Even if they could break through the encirclement and come here, what awaited them would only be the corpses of these commanders, or even no corpses at all. At this time, a black figure suddenly descended from the sky and came to the center of these Zerg commanders. The Zerg commanders were shocked to find that this black figure was the rebellious Zerg commander, Mingze. Chapter 671 Evolution. UAE Zerg commander hadn't said a word before he was pierced in the head by a tentacle that stretched out from Mingze's body. Like this commander, all Zerg commanders were pierced in the head by the tentacle. Villains die because they talk too much. Although I am not a villain, Mingze sneered and closed his eyes. The tentacles that pierced the heads of the Zerg commanders immediately began to wriggle wildly, and the bodies of these Zerg commanders slowly turned into dried appearance. With a slight breeze, these mummified Zerg commanders turned into powder and floated in the air. After a few seconds, all the Zerg commanders in the cave had been wiped out. At this time, Mingze suddenly opened his eyes, and countless bloodshot veins in his eyeballs were beating slightly. My body is starting to get out of control. Before Mingze finished speaking, his whole body began to swell. Tens of minutes later, a huge black viscous creature with a height of hundreds of meters stood up from the ground, and in the center of this creature was Mingze, who had fallen into coma. The monster moved slowly on the ground with its 5 giant legs like starfish. As the monster moved, tens of thousands of tentacles split from its body and inserted into the ground. Deep underground, because the commander was killed, the command power fell into the hands of the intermediate mantis worms, but these mantis worms were tragically penetrated by these tentacles before they could enjoy the power they had just obtained. As long as the Zergs were penetrated by the tentacles in a few seconds, they would be sucked dry. The heavy bone armor on the tank worms could not stop the tentacles from extending into them. These tentacles easily found the weaknesses of the tank worms and drilled into their bodies through the gaps in the tank worms' bone armor. In a few seconds, these tank worms were also sucked dry and turned into powder and dissipated in the air. As the monster continued to move, the insects hiding underground were sucked up by its extended tentacles. The size of this monster is getting bigger and bigger. Gradually, its height has reached 500 meters. The cross-sectional area of its body has also expanded to thousands of square meters. The tentacles that extend out can already spread to more than 10 square kilometers. All the Zerg units within these 10 square kilometers, whether they are the original Zerg or the new Zerg hatched by Mingze later, have been absorbed into powder, and all nutrients have been swallowed by this monster. The Imperial fleet in orbit was also shocked by this monster. They had never thought that Mingze would become such a terrible creature. But because of the order of the superiors, they would not attack this terrible monster before it was clear whether it posed a threat to the Imperial fleet. In fact, Mingze's consciousness has now shifted to the body of the monster, but he found that his body has been controlled by the instincts of prey, and he can't control the activities of his body at all. This body seems to need a lot of nutrition to continue to make itself bigger. Although Mingze doesn't know what this body wants to do, it must have its reasons for wanting to swallow food like crazy. After an unknown amount of time, Mingze had already lost his basic sense of time, and his body was still tirelessly searching for food on the planet. At this time, Xiaoluoluo had been taken back to orbit by the spacecraft of the Imperial fleet. The Imperial fleet was worried that Mingze might accidentally hurt Xiaoluoluo. Their worries were correct. Now Mingze had transformed all the Zerg troops he had hatched into his own nutrients. Now he no longer needed to rely on tentacles to move forward on the ground. His body had already floated in the air, and the 5 huge tentacles stretched out behind him, which were more than 10 kilometers long. Including its main body, its length reached 20 kilometers. After devouring all the food that could be found on the planet, Mingze suddenly felt that the hunger of this body disappeared, and he regained control of his body. Mingze closed his eyes and carefully felt his body. He now suspected that he was in the initial form of the Zerg Queen. As long as he continued to eat, he would sooner or later become a body as huge as the Zerg Queen's planet. And his body is not pure black gelatinous tissue. In the 5 huge tentacles of his body, there are millions of hatching capsules hidden, and Zerg larvae are rolling in these hatching capsules. They are waiting for the arrival of nutrition. As long as the nutrition is sufficient, these larvae can become mantis worms or tank worms, etc. In the center of Mingze's body, there are 5 huge hatching capsules. Mingze searched the genes of the larvae in these 5 hatching capsules and found that their genes are completely different from those of ordinary Zerg. Many Zerg ground units have been hiding their genes instead of the main genes. If nothing goes wrong, these larvae should be the space units of the Zerg. Mingze, who has regained control, controlled his body to roll in the air. He found that although this body looks huge, It is extremely flexible. Not only that, this body also automatically gave birth to organs that can resist gravity and gravitational propulsion organs, as if it was born for interstellar travel. As Li Mingze thought of taking off, this body lightly raised its head and rushed into the sky. There was no gorgeous tail flame of the spacecraft, only the roar caused by the air being squeezed. A few minutes later, Li Mingze had already left the planet's atmosphere and arrived in orbit. After entering the vacuum, he did not feel anything abnormal, and as the sun shone on him, he also felt waves of energy surging around in his body. Around Li Mingze, hundreds of Imperial warships surrounded him from a distance. These Imperial warships have not yet figured out whether Li Mingze has regained his sanity. Li Mingze looked at the Imperial warships surrounding him and began to look for organs in his new body that could communicate. The Zerg had communicated with the Empire at the beginning, and the Zerg warships must also have organs that can transmit ordinary signals. After searching for a while, an organ hidden in the corner was discovered and activated by Li Mingze. A communication signal was sent to the Empire's fleet. After a brief communication with the Empire's fleet, a small spaceship flew to Li Mingze's body with Xiaoluoluo. After the small spaceship approached, Li Mingze's 5 tentacles suddenly opened, revealing a huge airport. In the airport, Li Mingze was standing in the middle and waving his arms at the small spaceship. The spaceship carefully stopped on the deck made of bone armor, put Xiaoluoluo down, and then sped away. It seemed that the driver was quite afraid of this port in the monster's body. Li Mingze, who had separated from his new body, immediately went to Xiaoluoluo. I rushed home for a day on New Year's Day, and just finished these 2 chapters. Chapter 672 Split. After taking Xiaoluoluo back, Li Mingze started the hyperspace engine and disappeared into the vast starry sky. The commander of the Imperial fleet watched Li Mingze disappear, suppressed his worries, and lowered his head in deep thought. Although he didn't know why His Majesty Tianyi ordered them not to interfere with the freedom of movement of this weird Colonel Li Zhengyang, it was clear that this Colonel Li Zhengyang looked very threatening. But orders are orders. No matter how worried he was, he couldn't go against His Majesty Tianyi's order to chase Li Zhengyang back. At this time, Li Mingze had brought Xiaoluoluo to the sky above a colony occupied by the Zerg. The information of this colony was still what he had searched for from the navigation instrument of the wreckage of the Imperial spacecraft. Originally, this was a beautiful and rich pastoral planet with hundreds of millions of immigrants and countless animals and poultry, but the Zerg turned it into purgatory in just 2 days. The countless animals, poultry and civilians on this planet became nutrients for the Zerg troops. With the help of these nutrients, this planet became a shipbuilding base for the Zerg. The animals and humans on this planet have contributed tens of thousands of warships to the Zerg. 5,000 of them were transferred to other star systems by the Zerg, while the remaining 5,000 fell into hibernation and orbit, waiting for the order of the Zerg Queen. Li Mingze's arrival broke the peace here. When his 20-kilometer-long body appeared beside the orbit, all the Zerg warships woke up. The Zerg warships that had just woken up did not communicate with the unfamiliar Li Mingze at all. They fired countless bone spur shells, acid shells, and plasma shells at Li Mingze. 3 different colors of attacks came overwhelmingly towards Li Mingze. Li Mingze coldly controlled his body to meet these attacks. When he was about to collide with the flying shells, Li Mingze's body suddenly began to deform. The originally bloated body instantly shrank to a diameter of hundreds of meters, but the corresponding length was extended to hundreds of kilometers. As a result, the number of attacks he faced head-on became much less. Not only that, the body tissue that was in contact with the attack also turned into a layer of carapace tens of kilometers thick. Plasma shells, bone spur shells, and acid shells attacked this layer of carapace, directly cutting off the layers of carapace. But the carapace layer was too thick, and these attacks only cut off Li Mingze's carapace layer that was hundreds of meters thick. After seeing that most of their attacks were dodged by Li Mingze, the Zerg warships did not hesitate to change their combat strategy and directly concentrated all their firepower on a small area of thousands of square meters. Because the distance between the two sides was already very close, the opponent would definitely not be able to avoid this concentrated attack. And although the area of attack was much smaller on the surface, the duration of the attack would be longer and more lasting. However, what they didn't expect was that Li Mingze didn't try hard to dodge these shells. Li Mingze controlled his body to expand directly into a huge circle, and the center of the circle was the thousands of square meters covered by the shells. The shells that flew in front of him passed directly through the round hole in the middle of his body. It did not cause any harm to him. The Zerg warships that saw this scene were dumbfounded. They did not expect that the other party had shrunk in size at the beginning just to escape their second volley. It was too late to change tactics now. Mingze had already approached them within hundreds of kilometers. At this time, these Zerg warships could clearly see the small bulges that began to rise on Mingze's dark body. Although they did not know what these bulges were used for, it was definitely not a good thing. In fact, Mingze originally planned to pierce these warships with tentacles and then absorb them. However, he did not know the strength of the other warship's armor without testing it. If the tentacles he shot out not only failed to pierce their armor, but were taken advantage of by them, he would lose a lot. So he gave up this plan and began to approach the Zerg fleet. A few minutes later, Mingze, who came to the front of the Zerg fleet, directly used his slender tentacles to swing at the first Zerg warship. Before he threw out the tentacles, the hatching chambers in the tentacles had been transferred to the main body. The tentacles that were frantically pulled out turned into the shape of machetes during the flying process, and the surface began to harden. When the tentacles swung to the first Zerg warship, they directly cut off the Zerg warship. It seemed that this attack method was very feasible. Mingze began to turn his 5 tentacles into knife shapes and rushed into the Zerg fleet. Every time a warship was cut off, hundreds of tentacles would extend from his body and insert into the body of the Zerg warship that was cut into 2 sections and start sucking. After a few seconds, these warships would only have a hard outer shell, and all the soft tissues in their bodies were converted into nutrients by Mingze. As the number of warships absorbed increased, Mingze's body became larger and larger, and new tentacles grew on his body. Mingze, who rushed into the Zerg fleet, waved his scythe like the god of death, harvesting the lives of Zerg warships one by one. The remaining Zerg warships wanted to evade in all directions when they saw the bad situation, but Mingze would not give them this opportunity. His body turned into a huge net that stuck to all the Zerg warships and gathered them inside little by little. In the center of the big net were 5 giant blades that were constantly waving. Now Mingze was like a meat grinder that chopped up and absorbed the captured Zerg warships. After just 2 hours, only the broken shells of the randomly floating warships were left in the orbit of this planet. These empty shells all showed that there was once a huge Zerg fleet here. Mingze, whose body had grown to 50 kilometers long, came to the ground of this planet at this time. He turned his body into a huge carpet and began to swallow all the creatures on the ground into his body. Whether it was animals, plants, or Zerg ground units, they could not escape his clutches. The whole planet was like being erased by an eraser. Wherever Mingze passed, there was only mud and stones all over the ground. Even the microorganisms in the soil were turned over and absorbed by Mingze. At this moment, a tentacle of Mingze's mothership suddenly extended outwards and condensed into a huge tumor in the air. The size of Mingze's mothership began to shrink little by little, while the size of the tumor began to grow. After a while, a brand new split body that looked exactly like Mingze came out of the tumor. This split body also wrapped a humanoid creature that looked exactly like Mingze in the center, and it also had a huge body like an octopus that was 20 kilometers long. Chapter 673 The Second Reincarnation. The process did not end after the new individual was split. Because the hatching sac in Mingze's body had enough nutrition, a large number of Zerg soldiers and 5 Zerg warships began to grow. Mingze has now figured out the routine of his new body, which is to continuously devour organisms, and once a peak is reached, a new split body will be split out. At the same time, the hatching sac in his body will begin to hatch new Zerg soldiers and warships. In this way, as long as he continues to attack the Zerg and transform the enemies into nutrients, the size of his army will become larger and larger. Now he is a typical person who becomes stronger with each battle, so he needs to fight non-stop and transform all enemies into his own troops. After thinking clearly, he immediately took off from the planet and flew to the next destination, and the split body he just split out also jumped into hyperspace behind him. In this way, Mingze began to launch crazy sneak attacks in the heart of the Zerg territory, far away from the battle line between the Empire and the Zerg. Wherever he went, not only the Zerg troops would be transformed into his nutrition, but even the plants and animals on these planets were not spared by Mingze. The number of Zerg forces under his control began to grow steadily, from only him and 1 cleaver to 2 cleavers and 5 Zerg warships. Then there were 4 cleavers and 10 warships, 8 cleavers and 20 warships. When the number of cleavers reached 10, Li Mingze organized these 10 cleavers into a separate formation and let them go to the Zerg hinterland to hunt. Because the Zerg's forces were relatively scattered, each battle now did not require so many troops, so Li Mingze planned to let these cleavers bloom everywhere. Sure enough, after these cleavers were separated, the growth rate of the fleet was greatly accelerated. A month later, the war between the Sith Empire and the Zerg fell into a stalemate. Originally, the Zerg fleet was able to push the Empire fleet flat, but because of the dozens of fleets composed of Li Mingze and his cleavers making trouble in the Zerg hinterland, the Zerg had to withdraw a large number of fleets to encircle and suppress these cleaver fleets. In this way, the pressure on the Empire's fleet was greatly reduced, and the Empire had more time to build new warships for the battlefield. The only thing that puzzled Tianyi was that Li Mingze had not made any movement since he showed up last time. This puzzled her very much. Could it be that Li Mingze had hidden himself again and was planning something? Suddenly, Eva's communication request interrupted her train of thought. She frowned and connected the communication. Tianyi, something incredible has happened in the Empire. I suggest you come over, Eva said excitedly on the other end of the communication. When Tianyi controlled an artificial human body to rush to the place Eva said, it was already surrounded by reporters from various TV stations and news media in the Empire. What happened here? Tianyi did not reveal his true identity, but quietly asked a chubby male reporter who looked easy to talk to beside him. Seeing such a beautiful girl asking him, the fat reporter answered enthusiastically, yes. It's big news. A newborn baby actually told his mother that he was a maintenance worker who died in an accident. You know, the baby's vocal cords have just developed, and he hasn't received systematic training yet. This simply proves the existence of reincarnation. Finally, the fat reporter said with great certainty. Oh? You mean, the maintenance worker who died in an accident was reincarnated into the body of this baby, and he was reincarnated with his memories? Tianyi's eyes lit up. She remembered the two officers of the Empire, Li Zhangyang and Xiao Luoluo. When the intelligence of the two was reported to her, it was just said that Li Zhangyang and Xiao Luoluo had become Zerg. She thought that the two were transformed into Zerg bodies by the Zerg, which was her assumption. Maybe she should have watched the communication video of the two again to understand the situation in detail. But now it seems that the two officers must have died and reborn in the bodies of Zerg. Does this mean that people in this universe are likely to be reborn with their memories after death? She had to figure this out, because it was related to her finding Li Mingze's trace and the ethical issues in the Empire. Presumably, these mothers would not have thought that the children they gave birth to were actually reincarnated by someone else, and they also carried the memories of their previous lives, which might make these mothers not know how to face their children. Not only that, since they have been reincarnated into new people, do the previous marriage relationships still exist? Do the original relatives and jobs still exist? These are all issues related to the stability of the Empire. Tianyi immediately began to conduct a detailed investigation of the baby, such as the time of his birth, the time of his mother's pregnancy, and what his mother did before or during pregnancy. And what this person did before his death, when he died, and the relationship between the place of death and the place of birth. Did his mother approach him when he died, or did the two of them have any connection, etc.? In an instant, the final result was calculated. When the man died, his mother in this life happened to travel with his father to the vicinity of the death point. In other words, this kind of rebirth is likely to be based on the newborn within the closest distance. In other words, Li Mingze was likely born in the nearest family. Thinking of this, Tianyi immediately began to look for the families around Li Mingze who were pregnant when the system was disintegrated. However, the children of these families are now working in the Empire, and there is nothing abnormal, which is not like Li Mingze at all. Moreover, the highest order at the time was not issued from within the Empire, so these people were naturally excluded by Tianyi. So in the end, who did Li Mingze reincarnate into? Faced with this situation, Tianyi immediately began the experiment of reincarnation, and first selected a group of 10 death row prisoners. In addition, there are 5 female death row prisoners, and these 5 female death row prisoners correspond to different pregnancy cycles, artificial conception. In addition, there are 5 incubation chambers, which also contain 5 embryos of different stages and ages. Under Tianyi's order, 10 Imperial Marines walked up to the 10 male death row prisoners. In the desperate eyes of the death row prisoners, 10 Imperial Marines pulled the trigger. After 10 gunshots, the 10 death row prisoners fell to the ground, and the Marines stepped forward to carry the bodies of the 10 death row prisoners to the cleaning vehicle next to them and took them to the incinerator. The next step is a long waiting period. After the babies are born a few months later, the Empire will read their soul fluctuations to determine which ones have been successfully reincarnated, and thus determine the conditions for reincarnation. At the same time, Tianyi has also issued the latest decree to the entire empire, which is that after the reincarnated person has determined his or her soul ID, he or she can inherit his or her original assets and relatives. Chapter 674, Decisive Battle. At the same time, Mingze had deduced the approximate location of the Zerg Queen through the distribution pattern of the Zerg fleet. He began to secretly mobilize the splinters towards the location of the Zerg Queen. Although on the surface, these splinters attacked the Zerg planets irregularly, they were actually moving in the same direction. At first, the Zerg Queen was indeed confused and did not notice the approaching Mingze fleet. But after she accidentally dyed all the planets attacked by Mingze red in the star map, she suddenly found a huge arrow pointing directly at her current location. After realizing Mingze's true intention, the Zerg Queen did not panic, but became a little excited. Originally, these annoying Zerg ships' guerrilla warfare gave her a headache. Now these guys have given up guerrilla warfare and are planning to fight a tough battle, which she is eager for. It is easy for the Zerg fleet to destroy the opponent's few warships in a head-on decisive battle. This Zerg traitor is afraid that he has never really understood the strength of her Zerg. Under the order of the Zerg Queen, Zerg warships in most of the galaxy were mobilized. Regardless of distance, they all began to fly towards the star system where the Zerg Queen was located. In fact, Mingze had long known that he would be discovered sooner or later. If the Zerg could not detect such an obvious direction of advancement, it could only be said that the Zerg's IQ was not online at all. His plan was the same as what the Zerg Queen had expected, that is, to fight a decisive battle with the Zerg Queen in the Zerg base camp. Whether he succeeded or not, he bought precious time for the Imperial fleet and created loopholes in the Zerg's defense. When the fission fleet he controlled and the Zerg fleet arrived at the predetermined rendezvous point, a transport fleet of the Sith Empire also appeared in the same star system. After a long period of fighting to support the war, Mingze now has as many as 1,000 fission battleships alone, and 25,000 ordinary Zerg battleships. And this appearance of the Imperial transport fleet brought Mingze sufficient nutrient solution for him to give it a try. With the help of the robots, the Zerg warships controlled by Mingze began to line up and wait for the supply of nutrient solution. One by one, the input tubes were lifted by the robots from the Imperial transport ship and inserted into the bodies of the Zerg warships parked parallel to the side. The milky white nutrient solution flowed into the bodies of these Zerg warships along the pipes, making these Zerg warships instantly spirited. After all the ordinary warships were supplied, Mingze's split warships also approached. The split warships that had received enough nutrient solution were now filled with nutrient solution in their hatching sacs, and the larvae in the hatching sacs began to develop gradually. After confirming that there was nothing missing, Mingze greeted the Imperial fleet and then led his fleet into hyperspace. The commander of the Imperial fleet and a group of officers took off their hats or helmets and bowed slightly in the direction where Mingze disappeared. They knew that the chance of Colonel Li Zhangyang winning this decisive battle was less than 1 in 10,000, and this was a completely suicide mission. However, for the strategic layout of the Empire, Colonel Li Zhangyang still led his fleet to the Zerg base camp without hesitation. His fearless spirit was respected and admired by all the soldiers of the Empire. A few days later, in the star system where the Zerg Queen was located, hundreds of thousands of battleships of different sizes quietly floated in the orbits of the 5 planets in the star system, waiting for something. When Mingze appeared in the star system, these dormant battleships woke up instantly. They knew that the person they were waiting for had finally come. Under the command of the Zerg Queen, these battleships began to twist their bodies and rush towards Mingze. In a command room inside Mingze's battleship, Mingze and Xiaoluoluo were sitting on a sofa taken from the ruins of the Imperial battleship. In front of the two was a holographic projection projected in the air, but this projector was also a part of Mingze's body. Seeing the dense Zerg battleships flying towards him from the entire star system through the sensor, Mingze frowned slightly. Although he had expected that this decisive battle was almost impossible to win, he still wanted to give it a try. But now the number of these enemy ships is a little too much, far beyond the fleet he currently controls. Zhangyang, look here, Xiaoluoluo suddenly pulled Li Mingze's arm and pointed to a red planet in the holographic projection. What's wrong here? Li Mingze looked for a long time and didn't see anything unusual. There is obviously a planet here, but I just made a rough estimate of the orbits of the planets in the entire star system, and I found that this planet has no mass. In other words, the movement of celestial bodies in this star system completely ignores the existence of this planet. This planet has no gravity, and it cannot change the orbits of other planets in this star system. Xiaoluoluo pointed to the red planet and said excitedly. You mean, this planet shields its own mass, and only the Zerg can achieve this level? This planet is likely to be the mothership where the Zerg Queen is. Li Mingze clapped his hands suddenly, grabbed Xiaoluoluo and kissed her. Although this was an unintentional act of Li Mingze in the excitement, it made Xiaoluoluo stunned. What's wrong? Li Mingze looked at Xiaoluoluo with a puzzled expression. Nothing. Xiaoluoluo waved and sat back on the sofa. All warships, listen to my order. Protect the split warship in the middle, and make every effort to break through the planet I marked. Make sure that a split warship can land on this planet. Li Mingze ordered all his subordinates in the mental communication. Although these warship worms already have basic consciousness, the genes in their bodies determine that they must obey Li Mingze's orders unconditionally. 25,000 warship worms tightly wrapped Li Mingze's split warship in the middle. The entire fleet formed a sword-tip formation and rushed towards the target planet marked by Li Mingze. And Li Mingze himself and his warship were also protected in the center of the fleet. Seeing that Li Mingze's fleet launched a breakout, the surrounding Zerg fleet hurriedly began to attack. All the attacks continued to hit the battleship bugs on the outer layer of the fleet. Although their armor was stronger than that of ordinary battleship bugs, they could not withstand so many attacks at all. They could not even hold on for a few seconds before being blown into powder. Countless plasma shells and bone spurs were thrown at Li Mingze's fleet like they were free, and the ordinary battleship bugs on the outer layer of the fleet were soon all killed. Chapter 675 Landing successfully. After the outer warships were consumed, Li Mingze's split warships naturally pushed forward. These split warships in the outermost layer unfolded themselves completely, and thousands of warships were fused together after unfolding. These stretched-out split warships turned the entire fleet into a whole, and a thick layer of carapace wrapped all the warships on the outside. These carapaces were transformed from the body tissue of Li Mingze's split body. They have extremely strong fluidity. When a carapace is blown through, the carapaces of other parts will turn into liquid again and flow to the damaged part to reform a new carapace. With this complementary armored carapace, Li Mingze's fleet successfully broke through to a position close to the orbit of the target planet. At this time, the Zerg fleet was anxious, because they knew what the planet Li Mingze was rushing towards was. All the Zerg warships near Li Mingze rushed forward, trying to use their bodies to block the advance of Li Mingze's fleet. However, they would never have thought that their action of using their bodies to hit the Imperial fleet just helped Li Mingze a lot. Originally, Li Mingze's split fleet had exhausted the nutrient solution stored before the war and was in a state of exhaustion. These Zerg warships that hit were like spring water sent to the mouths of people who were about to die of thirst, just providing much-needed nutrition for Li Mingze's fleet. The Zerg warships that hit the dark outer shell of the Imperial fleet were directly deformed, and at this time, the split bodies took the opportunity to insert their tentacles into their bodies along their broken hulls. Due to the large number of tentacles, the first Zerg warship that hit Li Mingze's fleet was completely sucked dry in less than a second. Its empty shell was left far behind by the flying fleet. This also made these Zerg warships not notice the abnormality at all. After observing that Li Mingze's fleet paused slightly due to absorbing energy, these simple-minded Zerg warships thought that their tactics worked. Next, countless Zerg warships hit the outer shell of Li Mingze's fleet with themselves. Li Mingze also discovered the thoughts of these insects. He deliberately slowed down the speed, showing an illusion of getting slower and slower. He also made the shell in front of the fleet look dilapidated, giving the Zerg an illusion that if they tried harder, this big ship would be defeated. In this way, under the continuous death of the Zerg fleet, Li Mingze's fleet was refilled with nutrient solution. After seeing that the distance to the target planet was not far away, Li Mingze decisively ordered all warships to speed up and rush to the surface of the planet. At this time, nearly 1,000 surviving fission warships immediately dispersed and rushed towards the atmosphere of the planet. The fire caused by the intense friction between the fission warships and the atmosphere attracted the attention of the Zerg soldiers on the ground. Countless Zerg ground forces began to rush towards the possible landing point of the fission warships. They wanted to encircle and annihilate the enemy before the other side was fully deployed. And the plasma worms under the ground also drilled from the underground to the ground, and they aimed the petal-shaped organs on their backs at the fission warships, falling in the sky. After a short period of energy storage, millions of plasma shells rose from the ground of the planet and shot towards the split warships in the air. Mingze had long guessed the opponent's intention. His split warship suddenly spread its 5 tentacles in different directions. The originally shuttle-shaped split warships seemed to have turned into large umbrellas opened in the sky, but these large umbrellas only had ribs. When the split warships were all unfolded, countless holes suddenly appeared on the 5 tentacles that stretched out. Countless hatching capsules were shot out from these holes and fell to the ground. These split warships were like a shower on the grass, spraying hatching capsules all around crazily. The Zerg in these hatching capsules have already developed, and when the hatching capsules are about to land, they will expand and become an inflatable sphere. The Zerg soldiers on the ground were knocked dizzy by the hatching capsules that fell from the sky. Although the air capsules could absorb some of the impact, the kinetic energy they carried from falling from such a high altitude still severely injured the Zerg units on the ground. Although a large number of hatching capsules were melted by the plasma shells in the air, their existence broke the position of the plasma shells, causing the plasma shells to explode on the spot. Mingze's split warship took advantage of these gaps to shrink itself into a long and thin strip, successfully dodging the plasma shells and landing on the ground. The new mantises that landed first directly tore open the air capsules that wrapped them with bone blades and rushed into the Zerg troops that had been hit by the air capsules and could not move. The split body that had just landed directly turned itself into a thin film covering the ground. When the new mantises dragged the Zerg corpses onto this film, the corpses would be absorbed and used to hatch the mantises that belonged only to Mingze. Because this state is very similar to the fungal carpet in a game that Mingze played before, Mingze simply called this state the fungal carpet state. After these 20-kilometer-long split bodies unfolded into fungal carpet, the coverage area reached an astonishing 4,000 square kilometers. Most of the entire plain was covered by this black fungal carpet split body, and all the Zergs that stepped on it would be directly sucked dry by tens of thousands of tentacles. However, there are still some exceptions, such as the tank worm, whose skin is too thick, and the tentacles extended from the spread fungal carpet cannot be inserted into its body at all. Therefore, the tank worm became the only Zerg unit that could move freely on Mingze's fungal carpet body. Not long after the battle began, Mingze's Zerg, which was far inferior to the opponent in number, actually had the upper hand. However, this was obviously Mingze's illusion, because more and more Zerg appeared on the ground. In just a few minutes, the number of Zerg has doubled. And it takes a full 6 hours for his split bodies to hatch new Zerg mantises. After these 6 hours, Mingze couldn't believe what would be left of his troops. Zhang Yang, these bugs came out of the underground caves. There must be a lot of Zerg in the underground of this planet. Xiaolualuo pointed to a cave not far away that was swarming with Zerg. We can take advantage of our troops attracting their attention and go down to see for ourselves. Mingze touched his chin. Anyway, for him, as long as there are living creatures, he can create his own troops. And he and Xiaolualuo, 2 people who do not belong to this universe, will not die completely. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.